Hi, everyone. Welcome to NiceGamLii Chanel. If you find this content interesting or helpful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. Your support means so much to me, and it helps me create even better content. Thank you so much. The aloof school beauty is stealing in the soup, but I caught her red-handed with my phone. Seeing her trying to escape, I grabbed the strap of her bag. Under her panicked gaze, I dragged her to a secluded corner. Then, with a mischievous, I played the video on my phone. You wouldn't want the teacher or classmates to see that, I asked with a smirk. Her cheeks turned even redder. Her tearful eyes silently pleaded with me. But I wasn't buying it. Empty out everything you took into my hand, I demanded. Or do you want me to search? What a coincidence, Chu Wanning. This supermarket belongs to my dad. Her teary eyes looked up at me helplessly. She silently unzipped her backpack, taking out 3 loaves of bread she had stuffed in. I couldn't help but curse inwardly. Idiot. Why steal the cheapest bread? If you're stealing, at least go for something. You could have taken chicken drumsticks or milk. After she took out the bread, she opened her bag wide to show me, to prove it was now empty. It was indeed empty, but I wasn't planning to let her off. Last time, I saw Chu Wanning taking items off the shelf. Because we were classmates, I turned a blind eye to avoid. The next day, I heard that she died in a car accident. Although I didn't know I couldn't let her go back now. I'd already made up my mind. As long as she makes it, she can stay here overnight. With that thought, I dumped the contents of her textbooks, stationery, and and even a white sanitary pad. Seeing this, Chu Wanning's face turned crimson. She rushed forward to grab, quickly shoving them back into her bag. She snatched the bag away forcefully, but the strap broke in the process. Then she forcefully grabbed her bag back, but the strap snapped in the process. Chu Wanning looked up at me helplessly, her eyes slightly red. This only made her pure face more delicate and captive. I grabbed the torn bag back from her and casually tossed it on the. You think you can fool me? You come in with a bag and only steal 3 of the cheapest, I said, stepping closer to her. Are you hiding something else? Chu Wanning immediately raised her hand, shaking her head. She backed away like a bullied girl. Step by step, I smirked at her. Open the zipper yourself, or I'll do it for you. If not, the whole school will know about this tomorrow. Chu Wanning panicked. She hesitated before reaching for the zipper at her neck, slowly pulling it down. Her snow-white, slender neck was revealed. I noticed her t-shirt collar was wrinkled from being washed too many times, and beneath it, a glimpse of her delicate collar. But as the zipper went low, the culprit that caused the bulge finally popped. Chu Wanning's eyes turned red as she weakly spoke. See? I didn't hide anything. I leaned in closer, sniffing the faint scent of mixed with detergent. Isn't there another layer of clothing under this? Chu Wanning bit her pink lips. It's just one layer. Hearing this, I didn't push her further. Instead, I leaned forward, pulling at her collar with my teeth. There's nothing hidden in the sleeves. Chu Wanning shook her head and said, no. I sneered. It's not up to you to decide. I'll see for myself. As I moved my head toward her left armpit. Chu Wanning turned her face away in shame and anger, her cheeks burning as the faint. I also caught a whiff of a faint fragrance, unique, I checked the other sleeve as well. Chu Wanning, flustered, turned her head to the other side. At this moment, I noticed if a girl were being searched like this, her eyes should show. But Chu Wanning's eyes only held. In that moment, I realized something. Chu Wanning didn't actually she might even have some feelings for me. That explained why she had voted for me before. But in my memory, I couldn't recall any. Had I been too oblivious, thinking about my younger self gave me back. My world revolved solely around Song Xinyao. I practically groveled for her attention. Her slightest indifference could keep. Looking back now, I was truly snapping back to reality. I took nothing hidden in your pants, right? Chu Wanning obediently turned out, proving there was nothing. I didn't even look, just glanced at the clock on only a few minutes. The car that hit her probably hadn't even reached. I needed an excuse to keep just turning out your Let me check, I said, squatting slightly. I moved to feel the her long legs stretched out under the loose uniform. Chu Wanning shrank back, breathing nervously. I expected this, so I relented a little. There's a difference between men and women. It's indeed inconvenient. How about you jump in place twice? Let's see if anything falls out. Hearing this, Chu Wanning took a deep. After all, stealing is wrong, and indeed, it's not very. How about you jump in place twice? Let's see if anything falls out. Hearing this, Chu Wanning took a deep. After all, stealing was wrong. She had no reason to refuse. She raised her arms slightly as if gathering strength and jumped in place once. I pretended to check, looking for anything that might have, but my automatic focus betrayed, and my gaze instinctively. Both my eyes and head followed, nodding up and. Fortunately, she was focused on looking down, not noticing my gaze. Chu Wanning was about to jump again, but I quickly stopped her. Okay, it's enough, I believe you. I only took 3 pieces of bread, and I already returned. Can I go now? Chu Wanning's voice trembled with a hint of sobbing. I couldn't think of another excuse to keep her. Seeing my silence, She quickly walked to the table. She packed everything back into her bag. Just as she was about to leave, I called out, "Wait!" Chu Wanning turned around, clutching her bag tight, her teary eyes filled with caution. I couldn't help but ask, "Are you?" She looked down and didn't reply. I didn't say anything. Instead, I opened a piece of bread and handed it to her. "Eat it before you go." She didn't lift her head or reach out. She just stood there holding her bag like a punished child. Her frail body seemed like it by a gust of wind. I added, "I've already opened it. I can't sell it any." Then I forcibly placed the bread in her hands. A few seconds later, Chu Wanning put down her bag. She slowly lifted the bread to her lips and took a small bite. Then she ate faster. Seeing this, I smiled with satisfaction. But suddenly, 2 tears rolled down Chu Wanning's cheeks. From the moment she was caught she had stubbornly held back her tears. But as the bread entered her mouth, she could no longer hold. I quietly watched him. He turned around and tore open, then stuffed it into his free hand. Afterwards, he rummaged through his pocket and, realizing it was a tissue he had blown, he disdainfully threw it to the— Seriously? My 17-year-old self didn't even carry I couldn't understand what had happened how could it that a good student, both academic, would be forced to steal bread from a supermarket to eat. After finishing the second piece, Chu Wanning looked. Before I could turn around, he immediately went over. He ate while opening his backpack and took out a paper box. He scribbled a few lines on a piece of paper. When he finished writing, the bread was also gone. Chu Wanning quickly wiped his tears with his sleeve, then solemnly handed me the paper with both hands. I took the note and stared blank. It said, August 30th, 2015, Chu Wanning. At that moment, I didn't speak for a long. The handwriting was identical to the writing on the voting from my memory. Only then did I understand the person who quietly supported me was him, not Xinyao. I had always thought it was that green tea. So I got even more coincidentally, my family owned, so I had agreed to let that green tea move. Luckily, I could start over. I looked at Chu Wanning, casually tossing the IOU aside. I said, "You think writing an IOU is enough to settle today's matter?" Chu Wanning silently picked up the IOU from the ground, preparing himself for the worst. After taking a deep breath, he looked at me and asked, "How do—" I waved my hand and casually opened the door to the supermarket. "Follow me." "I accidentally tore your backpack, so I'll replace it." Chu Wanning hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "The torn part can be sewn back." I waved my hand and said, "This is my decision. I don't like owing people things." After speaking, I led Chu Wanning to where the backpacks. Chu Wanning's gaze immediately settled on a pink backpack. She seemed to really like it. I grabbed it directly and shoved it in. "This one's for you." Chu Wanning froze for a few and quickly said, "I don't." My backpack was already broken. She stubbornly put the backpack back. I frowned at her. "If you want today's events to be known by the entire, then go ahead and leave it." Chu Wanning froze and then silently took the backpack. She then took out the IOU from earlier, adding the backpack to the list. When she glanced back at the price of the backpack, her expression turned a bit bitter. It seemed she thought she could. Noticing her change in expression, I couldn't help but, "Since you've written an IOU, just come with me." Chu Wanning dejectedly lowered, silently following behind. I stopped at the stationery section, placing a pink pencil case into her arms. Chu Wanning glanced at the price and firmly refused. "I don't want it." I threatened her again. "If you don't want today's—" She cut me off angrily, stomping her foot instinctively. "I don't have enough money to pay." I crossed my arms and raised an eyebrow. "I never said you had to pay. Or you can think of another way to repay me." "Another way?" Chu Wanning lowered her head slightly, seemingly lost in. When she saw me smiling and staring at, she quickly looked away, but her flushed cheeks betrayed her thoughts. Afterwards, I continued shopping with Chu, but when we reached a certain Chu Wanning shyly turned to leave. "Stop!" I shouted, halting him. "Do you want today's events to spread around? I'm a bad student. You should know that. A bad student is capable of anything." Chu Wanning finally turned around slowly, his face completely flushed. "I don't need sanitary pads." I smiled brightly at him. "Don't need— Let me calculate. You've got one in your bag. One you're already used, so that leaves 2, right?" Chu Wanning clenched his tiny fists in frustration, looking adorably fierce yet unable to argue. I grabbed a pack of sanitary pads and tossed it to him. "Catch!" The young girl jumped slightly, raising her hand. She then updated the IOU, adding the item to the list. Quietly, she brought the pads close to her nose and sniffed. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of surprise and, "So they really have a fragrance." She had only used unscented, loose-pack ones. Sometimes, she'd even find tiny insect carcasses and would have to throw them. I walked with her toward the supermarket and, looking at her serious, "Walk carefully. Watch for cars and get home safely. Go to school as usual tomorrow. As long as you listen, today's events will be like they never happened." Chu Wanning didn't understand why I said these, but he still nodded lightly. Then he earnestly handed me the IOU with both hands. "This IOU will always be valid." I nodded. At that moment, Xinyao walked over with— I couldn't help but smirk in turn, since everyone involved in the sports was now here. It was time to settle this once and for all. I told Chu Wanning, Hey, don't leave yet. Just stay and watch the show. I only wanted Chu Wanning and see what was about to unfold between. She neither admitted nor denied, but still accepted all the gifts. However, she kept her distance. She said this time before graduation was an observation for me to prove myself. While my dad was restocking the soup, I was busy delivering goods to even my younger sister, who was in middle school, looked down for acting like a pathetic simp. It wasn't until after graduation that I found out Xinyao had been dating a senior for a year. Upon learning this, I felt utter. I threw myself into my work and ambitions. By my early 30s, I had a net worth. By then, Xinyao by her ex-husband I helped her quite a lot after that. Only now do I how ridiculous I've been over the years for this woman. At that moment, Xinyao voice, wow, Gu Xiaoze actually talked to Chu Wanning. So, do you think Chu Wanning is prettier or me? Xinyao leaned on the checkout counter, her sarcastic tone tinged with jealousy. Sitting in the cashier's seat, I coldly replied, are you here to shop? What would you like today, Miss Song? One of the girls beside her covered her mouth, giggling. Your classmate's family really owns this place is huge. Xinyao looked proud, waving her hand generously. Feel free to look around. Take whatever you like. Today it's on me. The two girls looked envious and eagerly started picking items in the store. Before long, they came back happily with their arms full and snacks, dumping everything on the checkout counter. They were clearly here for free. Xinyao also grabbed a few bottles and sweetly said to me, Xiaozi, can you get us a couple of big bags? I nodded. I began scanning the items one by one. Xinyao suddenly froze. She couldn't help but ask, what are you doing? I replied seriously, scanning the prices. Aren't you here to buy things? Hearing this, the two girls behind her exchanged a look, whispering, Yao Yao. Didn't you say we wouldn't have? Hearing her friends murmur, Xinyao face turned a bit awkward. Gusha, why are you being so stingy? It's just a bit of food. It's not even expensive. I chuckled. Exactly. If it's not expensive and you said you were treating us, Xinyao was left speechless. Chu Wanning blinked in surprise, watching the scene. In class, all my groveling hadn't gone unnoticed by him. Suddenly, Xinyao slammed her hand on the checkout counter. Don't tell me you're serious. I'm really mad. I looked at her curiously. So what if you're mad? What are you going to do about rob me in broad daylight? Xinyao expression suddenly, she seemed to consider. She cautiously asked, you're not upset because you saw me yesterday at the mall with the class monitor. Why are you so petty? It was just a coincidence that I waved dismissively. Relax. I was home sleeping all day yesterday. I didn't go to. Her frustration grew. Then what's your problem today? I smirked coldly. I'm perfectly fine. Buying things and pay. Isn't that a normal thing to do? After that, I turned to Chu Wanning and asked, don't you agree, Chu? Chu Wanning turned her head away, ignoring me. Xinyao two friends couldn't take it anymore. Yao Yao, let's just drop. We're not that desperate to eat snacks. Yeah, Yao Yao, it's not worth getting upset over this. Xinyao refused to back. She brought out her trump card. I'll tell you, the class monitor confessed to me yes. After saying this, she let out. Raising her fair chin, she added, that's right. It was at the mall yesterday. Hearing this, I laughed even harder. Let me guess. You neither accepted nor rejected. You told him academics come first, and you'll talk about it after. Xinyao was instantly enraged. Gu Xiaoze! What do you mean by that? I waved my hand. Nothing. Are you buying or not? If not, seeing two friends approaching to take the item. Xinyao immediately stopped them. Wait, you two. Today, this isn't about money. It's about his attitude. Gu Xiaoze, is this how much you like me? Do you believe I'll accept the class monitor's confession? I clapped my hands. Then I wish you success. And Chu Wanning, standing nearby, couldn't. But when I looked over at him, he quickly turned his head away. For a moment, there was panic in his eyes. Xinyao, still angry, shouted, you definitely went to Gu Xiaoze, you'll regret this. After saying this, Xinyao dragged her two friends. Suddenly my voice came from behind. Stop! Xinyao turned back with a smirk. Regretting so soon? I slapped the counter hard, startling the three girls. Regret my foot. Take those items and put them back. Xinyao stood there, mouth slightly open, her eyes reddened unconsciously. Her two friends, having heard of my reputation at school, quickly stepped forward. They returned all the items to their original place. After doing so, they rushed to Xinyao side. Let's go, Yao Yao. Xinyao was dragged and pulled out of the. Before leaving, her eyes were filled with. She glared at me angrily. After it was over, I felt. Chu Wanning walked back in, holding her back. What do you want to say to me? I didn't respond. I circled around the cashier, then walked up to her. I took out a pink hair clip from my hand and gently clipped it onto her loose hair. Chu Wanning hurriedly removed the clip. I don't want it. I pushed her hand back. It's a thank you gift. Last year, during the sports committee thank you for voting for me. Chu Wanning looked surprised. Her slender fingers gripped the pink hair clip. In her beautiful eyes, her gaze started to shift away. A few seconds later, Chu Wanning immediately shoved the clip back into my hand, then turned and hurriedly ran away. I quickly shouted after her, "Slow down on the road. Walk, don't run on the street. I'm reporting you to the school tomorrow." I took a few steps after her with Chu Wanning didn't turn back, but she did slow down and stopped running. She started walking in. I realized something. No matter how credible or not, as long as stealing gets reported, this kind of threat works on her. Next time I could use this threat to play some exciting game. Thinking of this, I looked at the hair clip in my hand. You voted for me, so what? Why is it so embarrassing? Is voting for me something shameful, or was she just shy? The next day, I woke up. I bought 2 breakfasts and quickly rode my bike, rushing to the classroom entrance in a hurry. I arrived out of breath. I didn't look at the homeroom, nor did I look at Xinyao. Instead, I looked at Chu Wanning. At that moment, he was helping classmates move. Hearing the commotion at the door, he and his classmates looked over. But soon, Chu Wanning's ears turned red, and he quickly turned his head away. I was overjoyed. He had successfully entered the senior class. I was so excited. I didn't notice the look from Song Shin, which was filled with, it was utterly At that moment, a loud noise came from the podium. I jumped in fright and forgot it. Homeroom teacher Chinhui glared at me. "Gushao's late on the first day of school? Let's assign seats. After that, I'll deal with you." I didn't care. I followed the 50-something classmates out into the hallway. At the start of each semester, the first task was to assign seats based on last semester's top students sat at the front, while the struggling ones. I was destined for the back corner but then I suddenly remembered. Last semester, I wasn't at the very bottom. The last place belonged to Chu. The reason was simple. He didn't attend the final exam. I couldn't help but chuckle. Suddenly, I heard my friend Lin Yu speak in a teasing tone. "Gu Xiaoze, happy now? This time, Chu Wanning will sit in." The homeroom teacher said with some concern, "If you can't see from the back, let me know. I can move you to the front." I immediately objected. "I disagree." The homeroom teacher glared at me. "You disagree? Who do you think you are? I'm warning you. Don't disturb Wanning during class. If I catch you doing that, I'll make you stand on the platform in the playground." Hearing this, Chu Wanning quickly raised his head. "Teacher, it's fine." After the month, Chinhui's expression softened into a smile. All right, Wanning, as long as you're okay. If Gu Xiaoze bullies you, just let me know." Chu Wanning softly responded. I shamelessly asked, "What counts as bullying?" As I reached out and poked Chu Wanning's soft arm. "Does this count as bullying?" I asked tentatively. Chu Wanning's earlobe on the same side. He moved slightly to the side. Then suddenly, he furrowed his brows and wrinkled. Seeing this, I asked, "Did you smell something?" "Welcome to the back row, the world of underachievers." Seeing his reaction, I laughed. Pointing to the side, I began to explain. "Those twins are Zhang Neng and Zhang Xing. People call them the biochemical. If they take off their shoes, the entire Lincheng No. 3 high school." Chu Wanning pursed his lips. That smile shocked me. "You actually know how to smile?" Chu Wanning quickly suppressed his smile. His face gradually returned to its usual. I continued speaking. "Look over there." Chu Wanning lifted his head, obediently following my gaze. "To the right of the twins is Zheng Feng," I introduced. "As soon as the bell rings for every class, even slapping him won't wake, and he drools so much he can draw maps on it. Guess what kind of god he is?" Chu Wanning didn't plan to answer, but he softly replied, "The sleep god." I smiled and nodded. Correct. The corners of his eyes and as if he was delighted for a moment that his thoughts aligned with mine. I continued to introduce. "Further to the right is our academic monitor, Li. He's farsighted, so he applied to the teacher to sit at the people call him the." Before I could explain further, Chu Wanning looked over. His beautiful eyes quietly gazed. "What's the sniper god?" I grinned mysteriously. "No way. I can't explain this one in detail. Study god. Now I officially welcome you to the back row." "Guess what kind of god?" "I don't want to guess." Chu Wanning. She opened her English textbook without. It was as if she was determined to guess. Chu Wanning slightly pursed her lip. She still ignored me. Her face turned to the other side. She seemed completely focused on her English book. Resting my head on, I said in a faint voice, "If you don't, I'll reveal your secret." Chu Wanning immediately turned her head, breathing light. She stared at me with an expression. Reluctantly, she asked, "What kind of god?" Her clear voice carried a hint of forced grievance. I smiled and replied, "The god of..." Chu Wanning exhaled in annoyance and muttered, "Boring." Then she turned her head back again. Smiling, I rested my head on one hand, brazenly observing her. For some reason, after saving, it felt like I had raised her myself. It was as if I were looking at my hard-earned daughter. 2.5 minutes later, she couldn't take it any. She turned her head. "What are you looking at?" I asked curiously. "Nothing," she replied. "I was just wondering why your..." Chu Wanning pressed her small lips tight, trying not to let me see. Then she turned her head back again. I retracted my gaze, took a bag of warm meat buns out of my bag, and handed them. In a commanding tone, I said, "Finish them during the break." Chu Wanning replied softly, "I don't want them." I glared instantly. Don't want them? Do you dare believe it? The girl immediately took the buns obediently, glaring at me angrily with her beautiful. Only then did I praise her in an exaggerated tone. That's better. Just listen, okay? The homeroom teacher forcefully slapped the desk. You're already in scene. I hope you know what your goals are. Are you going to keep slacking off, or are you going to give it? If you don't study hard this year, if like some people, you don't talk during class, rank at the and even disrupt others, then be ready to face the consequence. I leaned back, the corners of my mouth. In my last life, I'd already to have a net worth. In this life, I wanted to taste what going to college felt. But with my current grades, getting into college would be still having Chu Wanning, the study gave me an inexplicable sense of. Sometimes I really wondered if this guy secretly studied at night. Even though we hung out together, his grades were all. It really made me frustrated. I sighed and slapped my thigh. Chu Wanming was startled, hurriedly pulling her long legs together. I immediately apologized. Sorry, wrong move. The first period was in get your textbooks ready. Homeroom teacher Chin Hui, who was also the Chinese, gave a few more words of advice. He then glanced uneasily at the corner by the window, pointing at me with a fierce look, wordlessly threatening me, before leaving the classroom. The English teacher, holding her lesson plans, had been waiting at the door for a while. After Chin Hui nodded to her with she walked into the class. A pair of beautiful black stockinged legs caught. The bell for class rang, and a loud thud came from the right. Zheng Feng had fallen asleep on his desk. I also took out my English textbook, determined that I was going to study serious. Chu Wanming turned her head and looked at. She didn't say anything because sometimes the boys in the class could be quite for example, me. She often sees me suddenly, out of nowhere, jump up as if possessed, mimicking a basketball shot. Every time this happens, Chu Wanning stops and stares at me, bewildered. To avoid me noticing her gaze, she quickly lowers her head and walks past. Since then, she has thought I was strange. No matter if it's a paper ball or an empty bottle, I have to pick it up, throwing it toward the trash can in a perfect. Once during a break, I missed a shot. Sitting in the classroom, Chu Wanning, her beautiful eyes, blankly watching the busy boy in the hallway. She stared, mesmerized for an. At the same time, I was pressing on my right. Chu Wanning finally couldn't. What are you doing? She complained as the two pushed together desks. I replied solemnly, there's a demon in my right hand. It's about to break free. Classmate Chu Wanning, could you help me hold it? No response from her. I turned my head to find Chu Wanning staring at me with an expression. Seriously? Show some sympathy, will you? Childish, she muttered, turning her head back. At the same time, she moved the desk's imaginary bound. I wanted to talk to her again, but suddenly, the English teacher called my name. Gu Xiaoze, please stand up and read the first passage of the lesson aloud. I stood up and opened my clean text, reading the first passage smoothly and naturally. The moment the first word left my mouth, Shenqing's expression instantly changed. She looked up from her book in surprise. The entire class collectively, Chu Wanning was equally shocked, staring directly at such perfect pronunciation, and it's even British English. What happened to this guy? Shen Qingqing was utterly Gu Xiaoze, what have you been doing during this? Going abroad shouldn't have made your English this good. I answered seriously. Of course I've been studying hard. I'm preparing for college. Hearing this, Chu Wanning next to me showed a brief moment of surprise and delight. But in the corner, Liu suddenly burst out laughing. What kind of hard are you trying to? Chu Wanning silently glared at him. But Liu's comment caused the whole class to laugh. Only Xinyao didn't laugh, because he didn't want me to excel in other areas. Shen Qingqing walked up, patted me on the shoulder. I'm so glad you have this mindset. Well done. I believe in you. I smugly turned my head to look at Chu. She averted her gaze, her face cold and indifferent, giving. I sat down and playfully slapped. Chu Wanning flinched in fear once, angrily glaring at me. If you hit my, I'll tell the class teacher. I quickly explained, I swear, I hit them. I meant to slap my own, but Chu Wanning ignored me. I patted her arm and said, how about this? And you help me with other subjects. Deal? Chu Wanning turned her head as if to, but suddenly her expression, she quickly averted her gaze back to her desk. What's wrong? I turned to look. Outside the side window, a face slowly appeared, staring directly in our direction. It was the class teacher. Showing up like a startled, I flinched and instinctively sat upright. All my years of life couldn't prepare me for the pressure of this. Once the class teacher left, I noticed a piece of paper slowly being slid into my view. It was Chu Wanning's handwriting, sharp yet elegant. Seeing her agreement lifted my spirit. Maybe with effort this year, I could really get into a good university. I seriously focused on sat up straight and started paying attention. 5 minutes later, I earnestly lay down on the desk, and at that moment, the curtain was lifted and the bright sunlight shone on my sleeve. A sturdy hand reached up and drew the curtain closed. Seeing that the shadow completely shielded he finally relaxed and lowered resuming his diligent note-taking on the Not long after, Shen Qingqing's voice suddenly came closer. Chu Wanning looked up and found the English teacher holding it, slowly walking down the aisle. Nervously, Chu Wanning turned to glance at me, quickly reached out and patted my arm. I immediately sat, clutching my pen, pretending to stare intently. Chu Wanning kindly reached over with her and turned the page for me, right to the section with practice. At that moment, Shen Qingqing walked over, gave me a casual glance, and left. Chu Wanning let out a sigh while I immediately lay my head back down and continued. From the other side, I heard Shen Qingqing slap a book down on Zheng Feng's. Looking at the marks on one side of Chu Wanning pressed her lips. She felt very happy. In the past, she could only watch from afar as I got scolded. She wanted to wake me up but couldn't reach. But today, she managed to wake me, helping me avoid trouble. That strange sense of satisfaction and achievement. She turned back, and the gentle breeze from outside blew into the classroom, causing strands of the girl's hair to. At that moment, a pink hair clip was placed on his desk. Chu Wanning looked up, her gaze briefly fixed on me, but I had shifted position, turning my face to the other side. Chu Wanning pursed her lips. She refocused her gaze on the hair clip. The clip was really beautiful. After a moment of hesitation, she reached out and picked it up. She brushed a stray strand of hair upward. Then she used the clip. She couldn't see how she looked in that moment. Instead, she turned to the reflection in the window. With her hair pinned, her delicate features became more visible. The contours of her elegant face were now clearer. She raised her hand and gently removed wrapping it carefully in a piece of paper. She tucked it into the small compartment of. Soon, the bell marking the end of class, I stretched lazily and turned to look at Chu Wanning. Not seeing the clip on her head, and with it also missing from the desk, I figured she had kept it. I knocked on her desk lightly, reminding her about eating lunch. She pulled out a still warm bun, offering it to me with shaking her head and saying she really liked handing things over. I liked it too. There was something charmingly contrasting about that act. Then tell me, did you have breakfast? In a cold tone, she explained, I don't eat breakfast. I impatiently said, I told you, eat it now. Don't make me angry. Chu Wanning glanced at me, then reluctantly opened the plastic bag. She took a bun out of the bag and nibbled at it. Her eyes lit up when she reached the meat. The next bite she took was much bigger. She quickly finished one bite and seemed to realize that her eating pace might. Chu Wanning shyly looked at me, her ears turning red. She turned away to face another direction. I watched the scene with satisfaction. This must be what raising a daughter. After finishing the second, 2 more remained in the bag. Chu Wanning glanced at. She hesitated for 2, then silently tied up the plastic. Carefully, she explained to me, I'm full. I'll eat the rest at lunch. I slapped the desk, startling Chu Wanning, who flinched. In a stern tone, I said, I told you to eat. No excuse. No backtalk. Chu Wanning glared at me with a cold. I leaned closer, pointing at her. You dare keep glaring and I'll. Chu Wanning quickly untied the bag and obediently took a third bun to her mouth. However, her pace of eating slowed. Seeing her comply, I nodded in satisfaction, thinking to myself, I'll enjoy this forever. At that moment, Xinyao walked over. She said, come outside. I turned around and asked, what for? Xinyao turned and left. When she reached the door, she assumed but when she looked back, angrily, she yelled back, Gu Xiaozhe, you're getting more and more. Her voice caught the attention of many in the classroom. The gossipy ears all perked up. I impatiently looked at Xinyao. What's wrong with you? If you've got something to say it here. Xinyao walked back over. Standing by my desk, she hesitated to speak loudly in front. Gritting her teeth, she whispered, you need to stop. I said I'd accept Wang Ming just to scare you. I was only joking. I don't like him. I burst out laughing. Then do you like me? Xinyao's face turned red as she hurriedly replied, we're still young. We can't date yet. Wait until we graduate. At that moment, Chu Wanning coldly reminded. The teacher. Xinyao turned around and saw the class teacher Qinhui walking into the classroom. He always liked starting class early during breaks. Xinyao stomped her foot in frustration and reluctantly returned to her seat. Time gradually approached noon. The students in the class either went home. Xinyao hadn't found a chance to talk to me all morning. Now that he found an opportunity, he quickly came over. Accompany me to the cafeteria. I shook my head. Sorry. I need to study. Xinyao couldn't do anything. In the end, he was dragged away by another. Gradually, only Chu Wanning and I were left. I turned to look at the girl beside me. Each time she went to the cafe, what exactly did she eat? Or did she not eat at all? Chu Wanning sat quietly at her seat, seriously completing the assigned by the teacher. She seemed unaware that we were the only 2 left, and since I had promised to work hard, I couldn't just sit there idly. Most people who were reborn either went back to just after or to their kindergarten years. But I was reborn into the ultimate hell of the start of senior year. If I lived two lives, that would be such a waste, wouldn't it? No, this time Anyway, there's still a year left. I immediately took out my text and started reading it word. 5 minutes later, the sound of my steadily echoed throughout the classroom. Chu Wanning turned to look and found me sound asleep. She didn't know what I was dreaming of, but I scratched my nose and a faint smile appeared on her face. Chu Wanning stared at me for a moment, only snapping out of when she noticed my drool about to drip on. She quickly took out a tissue from her, folded it in half, and carefully placed it at the corner of my mouth. After setting the tissue, her hand lingered for a moment before pulling. He had a secret that no one knew. He had known me since middle school. In his mind, he carried many memories about me, but he also knew that I didn't remember any. Perhaps I never cared at all, but it didn't matter. He remembered. Thinking of this, Chu Wanning couldn't help but lift his and gently touch the tip of my nose. When my snoring paused, he quickly pulled his hand back. He sat upright, his heart racing. When my snoring resumed, Chu Wanning let out and relaxed. After sitting, he quietly stood up, slung his bag over his shoulder. This was his usual time for lunch. When he arrived at most students had already finished eating. The cafeteria was empty, and the cleaning ladies were already tidy. A short-haired cleaning lady noticed Chu Wanning and greeted him warmly. "It's you again, young lady. How many times have I told you? Come earlier next time." By this time, all the dishes are gone, leaving only soup. Chu Wanning gave a shy smile and said, "I'll just eat plain rice." A long-haired cleaning lady nearby recognized and remarked, "She's so young. You don't know, coming late probably means she—" The short-haired lady exclaimed, staring warmly at Chu Wanning, "You're so pretty, like a goddess. And you're so good at studying. If my son were half as good as you, let me give you more rice, and I'll add some meat broth." After serving the rice, the short-haired lady said, "Just pay 50 cents. Chu Wanning softly said, "Thank you." After swiping her, Chu Wanning noticed there was only 5.5 yuan, 50 cents for a meal. Still felt like a luxury for her. But without food, there's no energy. Chu Wanning carried her plate and found a seat in the corner. She ate slowly, not wasting a single grain. Meanwhile, I suddenly slumped forward, then stretched lazily. It was then I realized I'd been sleeping for almost. I immediately got up and headed to the. By that time, even the cafeteria ladies were clear. I ran over shouting, "Wait, don't clear it yet. Is anyone still here?" The short-haired lady looked puzzled. "You were studying I shamelessly replied, something like, "Auntie. By the way, was there a pretty girl who came to eat early?" The short-haired lady, "That girl always studies until very late. Every time she comes, only plain." I paid 2 yuan for some rice too, and found a seat, shoveling rice. It seemed Chu Wanning only ate. At this age, kids tend to. Chu Wanning was no different. I understood this very well. But what puzzled me was where she went after lunch. A few students had returned to the class. Chu Wanning walked in, with her bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes went straight to the corner of the where the duty roster was usually written. The words "clean the blackboard and podium," but my name had been defaced with jerk. Chu Wanning walked over and erased replacing them with Xiaozhe using chalk. Then, without a word, she threw the chalk on. Afterward, she expressionlessly walked back to her seat. Just as she sat down, a voice came from the doorway. "Chu Wanning, I just noticed your new bag matches mine. It's a." Chu Wanning turned around and saw Xinyao standing. She gave him a cold look and ignored him, walking straight to her seat and putting down her bag. Xinyao was frustrated. However, she did not. She only cursed weirdo silently in her, always putting on a cold face for whom. Actually, she didn't dare to provoke, because among the girls, there was a rumor about. It was said that Chu Wanning was targeted because she was exceptionally beautiful and cold. Several girls waited for. They deliberately used scissors to cut her, but they didn't expect Chu Wanning. She directly grabbed the scissors. In front of those girls, she cut her own long hair up, then she threw the thick strands of cut at those girls. Since then, Chu Wanning has. Girls didn't dare to provoke her, and boys didn't want to either. Xinyao angrily returned to her. 20 minutes later, I, who had gone home to nap, also appeared at the class. Returning to my seat, I wanted to talk to Chu Wanning, but considering I gave up on mentioning it directly. At that moment, the homeroom teacher, Qin Hui explained that before English, he wanted to discuss the upcoming autumn sports. As per tradition, we would select class uniforms for the parade. Hearing about the previously lifeless class instantly became. Kijen excitedly exchanged glances with class. The tacit understanding was evident. Qin Hui presented 2 pictures, one of black suits. The homeroom teacher said, The class president has chosen for our class uniforms. Has chosen 2 proper class uniforms for us. Which one would you like for the parade in the next class? All the boys in the class excitedly and unanimously cheerleader uniforms, while the girls, their cheeks slightly. Only a few girls, including Xinyao, seemed a bit excited. At this age, girls rarely wore short skirts, whether at home or at school. Everyone was relatively. I glanced to the side and saw Chu Wanning focused on her textbook. I suddenly remembered that during last semester's Chu Wanning didn't participate because she was the only one in the class who didn't buy. I shifted my gaze and said nothing, silently watching the homeroom teacher. Of course, I wanted Chu Wanning in a beauty. I could even pay for her uniform. In fact, I could afford dozens, but simply giving money or clothes was the least reliable solution. So I could only act as if nothing happened. The teacher waved his hand and said, "All right then, girls, I don't understand the details, but in any case, make sure to pay within a week. Submit your size and payment," the teacher added, and the class president, Wang Mingyu, clapped and reminded everyone each set cost 50 yuan. The excited boys cheered, while the shy and expectant girls blushed. Chu Wanning, hearing the price, looked up in surprise, then quietly lowered her head. The dull afternoon classes finally ended. Since it was the first day of school, there was no evening After the 4th period, students were free to leave. When there's no evening and the last class is PE, it's an explosive surprise for the I packed my bag, turned to Chu Wanning. "So it's settled. Come to my house this Saturday. Come to my house this Saturday." Chu Wanning suddenly froze. While packing her bag, she replied in a cold voice, "I can go to, but your house must have a guard." I nodded earnestly. Yes, it does." Chu Wanning said nothing more. After packing, she held her pink backpack in both, looked at me with some skepticism, and nodded slightly. I smiled, feeling like I had successfully lured, but I truly thought of her as my own daughter. Seeing that the others had left the classroom, Chu Wanning and I quickly headed down. I intentionally waited to walk along, but noticed she was walking slowly as if deliberately keeping I didn't mind and walked ahead, hands in pocket, heading to the playground with my. Only then did Chu Wanning speed up a bit, with her pink backpack. At that moment, I realized our blue and pink backpacks made. After some warm-up runs on the playground, the PE teacher announced free activities. The whole class cheered and scattered like birds and bees. I headed to the basketball court with a few boys, while Chu Wanning walked to the steps to put. During every free activity, she would spend the time staring at. This time was no different. She wasted her gaze on the game. I quickly dribbled past my opponent, leaving Wang Mingyu out of position. Taking 3 steps to the basket, I delivered a powerful dunk. The hoop buzzed, landing gracefully. Chu Wanning, sitting on the steps, looked. Xinyao and her 2 friends, who were watching from the edge, were also stunned. Wang Mingyu frowned at me and asked, "You can dunk?" They were regular basketball, but it was the first time they realized I could dunk. Even I was a bit surprised. But it was the first time they realized I could. Even I was a little. Since my rebirth yesterday until now, I've noticed that my strength has increased. My jumping ability has naturally. Is this an unexpected perk of rebirth? Couldn't it have improved my intelligence? And what's the use of just being stronger? Will it help me get into college? On the sidelines, Song Xinyao's face turned. She excitedly shouted, "Gu Xiaoze, you were so cool." I glanced at her indifferent and then shifted my gaze to the distant steps. Suddenly, our eyes met. In that moment, Chu Wanning immediately turned her head away. She held her textbook tightly against her chest, mouthing words, pretending to silently recite her lesson, but her earlobes turned red. "This girl is as predictable as ever. I was playing so well, and you, as my daughter, didn't." I retracted my gaze and noticed Song Xinyao and her 2 friends still gazing at me with admiration. "Gu Xiaoze, your dunk was really amazing." Song Xinyao spoke again, her tone hinting that she rarely complimented. It felt like a rare occasion. I responded with a faint. At that moment, I glanced toward, and my expression changed. I rushed toward the steps. A group of students had gathered there. I pushed through the crowd and saw Chu Wanning sitting, showing pain as she held her right ankle. The PE teacher asked what happened. A nearby girl hesitated before saying, "I think I saw another girl," pushed Chu Wanning from behind. Then she fell down the steps. I coldly asked, "What did the girl look like? Which class is she?" Wang Ping glanced at me, wondering why I sounded like I was seeking revenge. The girl lowered her head and softly replied, "I didn't see clear. Damn it, what the hell? She'd better hope I don't find." I loudly cursed without holding back. Then, I quickly walked over and squatted next to Someone help me take her to the infirmary. The girl I worked so hard to protect, and someone still dared to harm her without fear. Several girls immediately stepped forward to help. She hopped on one foot, glancing hesitantly at my broad school uniform. Seeing that I didn't react, I impatiently turned back and said, "Get on." Chu Wanning bit her lip, opened her arms, and gently leaned her upper body onto my back. At that moment, the anger on my face suddenly disappeared. Noticing me frozen in place, the PE teacher asked, "What's wrong? Can't carry her? Let me do it." Hearing this, Chu Wanning wrapped her arms around my neck, her earlobes turning bright. She looked embarrassed. I quickly said, No, it's fine. My leg just fell asleep. I'm fine now. I immediately stood up, grinning at the PE teacher. The teacher gave me a strange look. After standing up, I supported Chu Wanning's legs with both. Noticing that she was sliding, I adjusted her position. At that moment, the weight of the world seemed to. I couldn't quite describe the feeling. If I had to describe it, I'd say I now had a deeper understanding of the term. The softness in showbiz but the softness I felt now was 100%. Whoever gets to marry her in the future will be so lucky. Carrying her all day would never. I carried Chu Wanning to leaning forward slightly so she could. Then I took a few steps forward and let her grab my back. Just hang it around my neck, I said. It's heavy. It'll hurt your neck. Her voice soft and close to my ear. Seeing her holding 2 backpacks, I quickened my pace, heading straight to the school infirmary. I saw him carrying a backpack, worried that his arm. I quickened my pace towards the school clinic. What I couldn't see was the girl's face at that moment had already lit up with as warm as the spring sun. When we reached the clinic, I carried Chu Wanning on my back and I didn't see the doctor any. Where's everyone? I looked again. Still no one was there. I had no choice but to put on a bed covered with disposable sheets. The girl sat on the edge, her toes just barely touching the ground. I looked around again, but still found no one. Forget it, I'll do it myself. I pulled a stool and sat in front of Chu Wanning. Suddenly, Chu Wanning clamped her leg and asked warily, "What are you checking if it's just a sprain or something more serious, like a fracture?" Meanwhile, the tips of her earlobes, she coldly asked, "Do you even know how?" "Of course," I replied. "Back in my rural hometown, I often checked on the village's sew." Chu Wanning, puzzled, asked, "Sews? Why?" Suddenly, she realized something. Blushing with embarrassment, she punched my shoulder. I laughed and reached for her right. Her canvas shoes were very clean, but the edges were cracked in many. The cracks were even yellowed, showing they had been worn for a long. I took off her shoe. A clean white sock came into. Chu Wanning bit her lip shyly, clamping her legs tightly together. But what I did next almost made her kick me in anger. Lin Zhenqi brought her sock-clad foot to his nose. Chu Wanning hadn't even reacted. When I curiously asked, "How come your feet don't?" "Are you crazy?" she shouted. Even someone as cold and composed as couldn't help but curse at this moment. "Nini, are you insane?" Even someone as cold and composed as Chu Wanning couldn't help but curse at this moment. Moments later, I relaxed and said lightly, "It's nothing. You just twisted it. The swelling isn't bad. Some medicinal oil will do." After saying that, I turned to search the drawer. Sure enough, I found half a bottle. Twisted ankles are a common thing among students in such cases, I guess the school usually just applies some of this stuff. After applying the medicinal oil on, we left the clinic. Just as we left, a small room in the clinic, 2 men hiding inside, walked out. One was a young school doctor in a white coat, followed by a middle-aged man. He was the senior year director named Jiahao. The senior students affectionately called him Gary Tian in private. The school doctor awkwardly said, "Director, it's just hemorrhoids. If students come, you could have just pulled. Why did you insist on hiding with?" Gaihao's face turned dark as he patted his shoulder. 2 men in a small room in broad daylight, and I was just pulling up my pants. What do you think the students would assume? The school doctor, Xiao Wu, suddenly froze in place. By now, school was already over. Chu Wanning said she wanted to go back. I let her head towards the teaching building. I walked to the garage to get my bike and go home. As I pushed my bike to the school gate, I couldn't help but think about Chu Wanning's twist. I didn't even know where this girl lived. Was it far? Would she have to limp all the way home like that? I sighed, patted the bike seat, and reluctantly turned back to the teacher. I'll take her home today. When I reached the window of the senior year class, I slowed my steps and stopped. The empty classroom didn't have Chu Wanning study. Instead, she was limping around the podium, holding a chalkboard. She was trying hard to tiptoe and erase the black. The third period in the afternoon was the history teacher, a man over 1.9, always liked to write on the top of so Chu Wanning struggled to clean it. She tried her best to raise lifting her right hand high, but she still couldn't reach the scribbles on the blackboard, which looked. My gaze shifted silently to the duty roster. It read, "Blackboard and podium duty." On the podium, Chu Wanning let her arms fall, and after a moment of rest, she took a deep breath. Then, balancing on one foot, she jumped up, stretching her arm to reach the very top. Just as the eraser was about to touch, a large hand appeared in her line of sight. That hand grabbed the eraser from her. Chu Wanning turned her head, her injured ankle landing on her sprained ankle caused her to lose balance. Seeing this, I pulled her back upright. Our eyes met for a moment. Chu Wanning, however, looked as though she had been caught doing something wrong. She quickly, nervously stammering, Didn't you? I stared at her without flipping the eraser in my hand a few times. Then I raised it and effortlessly reached the top, wiping the blackboard clean. After that, I tossed the. No wonder I've never cleaned the blackboard before. And the teacher never Was it always you who covered for me? I said, rubbing my forehead and correcting. Not a cover for me. Chu Wanning turned her face away, refusing to meet my. She muttered nervously, No. After saying that, her eyes darted around and then she quickly glanced at me again. Anyway, if there's nothing else, I'll get back to studying. She quickly glanced up at me again. There's nothing else. I'm going back to study. After saying that, she turned to step down. I quickly grabbed her arm. Don't study today. Your foot is injured. I'll take you home first. You can study at home. Chu Wanning immediately refused. I frowned. Where do you live? She shook her head. Not far. I looked at her skeptically. Fine, but you can only study at 6:30 sharp. You must go. I'll stay in class to make sure. She glanced at me Then I won't study. I'll go home now. I nodded with a smile. That's the right decision. After she finished packing, I walked to the class. There was some noise from the post. I turned back to look. I saw Chu Wanning carefully cleaning the chalk dust. As part of my duty as a class monitor, I was indeed responsible for, and she still said she wasn't helping. She was practically doing everything. After finishing the podium, she walked over with her head down. She quickly walked past, her expression unnatural. I chuckled softly. The phrase, arrogant ice queen, suddenly seems. I pushed my bike and walked with her to. We were about to part ways. But I patted the back. How about I give you a ride home? Chu Wanning clutched her, looking conflicted. No need. If my dad sees a strange, Chu Wanning lowered her voice barely audible. He'll chase you with a stick. Hearing this, I raised an eyebrow. A soft voice began to. He would chase people with a stick and hit. Hearing this, I raised my eyebrows sharply. Your dad is so. The expression on Chu Wanning's showed a fleeting moment of. She nodded gently, then turned around and walked in the opposite direction. I called out, Hey! Chu Wanning turned around and looked at me. I helplessly said, You're leaving school without saying goodbye. Hearing this, Chu Wanning rarely showed a smile on her usually cold face. Bye-bye, she said. I smiled back, my smile filled with kindness. Watching the girl walk away, her steps a bit hesitant. But man, I turned around, got on my bike with peace of mind, and rode toward home. Hearing the sounds behind, Chu Wanning also looked back. She stared at my figure standing still for a long. Not until I disappeared into the crowd did Chu Wanning turn back around. After arriving home, I pointed and loudly to my dad, mom, and sister. I'm going to study hard. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to get into a top. Hearing my roar, my mom clapped enthusiastically, while my dad, sitting at the table, laughed out loud and continued cracking, not taking it seriously. But I was second to last on last semester's final exams. I made progress. Suddenly, I dropped the sunflower seeds in my hand on the floor, staring at him in shock. Is that true? It's no wonder my dad had such an For 2 consecutive years, I had been the last in the grade. Of course it's true. Someone missed the exam, so naturally, I was second to last. Hearing this, my dad's smile froze. He threw the sunflower seeds back into the plate. Listen to this kid talk. He just wasted a few seconds of my life again. Back in my day, I could score 37 out of 100 on a test. And you? On a 150-point test, you could only. Each generation of detectives, you didn't inherit any of my genius genes. I seem to have found the reason for my poor academic. Dad waved his hand and said, Forget it. It's like playing music. I'm going to check on, he said. Mom asked, puzzled, Isn't Aunt Lou there? Why are you going? Dad waved his hand again, saying, So she quit to take care of him. Now the supermarket is short. Hearing this, I got an idea and quickly said, Dad, I have someone who can take over Aunt Liu's job. Dad turned to me and asked, Who? I continued, My classmate. Dad glanced at me and said, A student? What's so good about that? I quickly grabbed his arm and pleaded, He can work at the supermarket and you can pay him a lower salary. Hearing this, Dad thought for a moment and said, If it delays his studies, you'll have one less competitor. Bring him to see me for an interview tomorrow. I'm heading to the super. I immediately turned back to my room, and from under my bed, I pulled out a dusty cardboard box. Inside were all my textbooks from grade. After cleaning up the textbook, I moved them all to my desk. I had almost no foundation in the grade 10. This time, I decided to focus on study, but reading really made me sleepy. Half an hour later, I fell asleep on my desk. The next morning, I arrived at the school gate early. At that, I suddenly saw Song Xinyao being stopped by a teacher. The teacher, wearing glasses, was sternly scolding Song Xinyao. He lowered his head. I ignored it and pushed my bike into the school gate. Song Xinyao suddenly looked up and saw my back. He couldn't believe it and rubbed his eyes. Did the sun rise in the west today? Guxiaozi came so early. The bell for the first class rang. I quietly stuffed the steamed buns I bought into without saying a word. He stared at my neck, wanting to speak, but hesitating. I waved my hand and explained, "Don't I studied too late last night?" So I tightened my neck on purpose. Hearing this, Chu Wanning gave me an incredulous. Then, as if realizing something, he turned his face. Not worried, he smiled faintly, closed his eyes, and lay down on his desk. Listening to class now was useless. I hadn't built the foundation. Listening now was like hearing I rested my head on the desk, partly to relax and partly to consolidate what I had learned yesterday in my mind. Chu Wanning touched the warm, steamed and licked his lips. While I was asleep, he secretly put 2 of them into his plastic lunchbox. I noticed it, but I didn't call him out. About 10 minutes later, I lifted my head from the desk. Seeing I was awake, Chu Wanning quickly turned around. Looking formal as he confessed, "I just stole 2 steamed buns." I turned to look at him, smiled, and said, "You stole them, so why are you reporting it to me?" Chu Wanning lowered his head, his expression embarrassed, and quickly turned away again. Both his earlobes were red. It was clear he wasn't good at lying, but for the first time, someone could look so cute while lying. Soon the morning classes ended, and it was lunchtime. Xinyao walked to the back row and said, "Guxia, can you have lunch with me today?" I shook my head, glanced at him, and said, "No, I'm studying," and left. I took out my grade 10 text and spread it out on the desk to Xinyao stomped her feet angrily. "With your grades, what's even worth studying? Are you deliberately trying to—" Hearing this, Chu Wanning coldly glanced at Xinyao and then lowered her head to continue. I slapped the desk and pointed toward the classroom door. "If you're upset, leave. Don't make me kick you." Xinyao looked like she was her lunch buddy and quickly pulled her away, saying, let's go. Why bother with him?" Only then did Xinyao glare. After everyone in the class left, only Chu Wanning and I remained. During that time, Chu Wanning glanced at me and saw that I was genuinely focused. My change made her unable to suppress a small but the next moment, I looked over, and Chu Wanning immediately turned her head, flipping through the pages of her book. Time ticked by, and when it was her usual lunchtime, she stood up. I stood up at the same time and stretched. That was a productive study. The cafeteria is probably out of food. Chu Wanning ignored me. Quietly leaving the classroom, I followed her slowly. At the cafeteria window, I walked over to Chu Wanning's and sat down across from her. The girl glanced at me, then lowered her head and quietly ate. I took out my backpack and placed all the snacks I brought from the supermarket. I knew the cafeteria would run out of food, so I brought snacks. I muttered to myself as I unwrapped chicken legs, marinated eggs, and sauce, placing them on my tray. Just as I was about to start eating, I suddenly, "What's going on today? No appetite. Could it be that I've been eating too many snacks lately?" I looked up at the girl sitting across from. I took her tray over and replaced it with my snack-filled tray. "Fine, let's switch meals today." Chu Wanning looked up at me with I quickly gestured for her to stay quiet. Chu Wanning stared at me. She kept her mouth shut. I lowered my head and began. The girl quietly watched me eat where she had eaten. Her long eyelashes trembled slightly. As I ate, I exclaimed, "Delicious. Why does your rice taste better than mine?" But Chu Wanning didn't seem angry at all. She quietly picked up and softly said, "Thank you." I pretended not to hear. After I cleaned my plate of rice and said to her, "By the way, my family's supermarket is short of a cashier. This is an official notice. You're hired." Chu Wanning looked up at me. I pointed at her bossily. "The salary is half that of a regular. If you dare complain or refuse, you know the consequences." Chu Wanning looked at me quietly, then earnestly straightened her posture, showing, "I'm willing," she said. I nodded with, "That's good." Chu Wanning happily resumed eating. She only ate one braised, then ate half of her rice. She took out a lunchbox and then poured the remaining rice, chicken leg, braised egg, and sausage into the lunch. I was stunned. "What do you do?" Chu Wanning looked up and said, "For my dad." "What? For your dad?" I felt like my ears were hearing something Wait, are you saying you're leaving school now to bring this meal to him? Chu Wanning nodded slightly. She seemed to sense my disapproval. She quietly stopped, putting snacks into the lunchbox. After all, those snacks were brought by me. She sat there nervous, looking a bit awkward, as if waiting for me to take the snacks back. She clearly knew I gave her the snacks to eat, not for her dad. I didn't understand. Actually, I've had a problem with Chu Wanning's father forcing his daughter to steal noodles let alone eat them, and even asking her to bring food from the school cafeteria. A surge of anger rose from my bubbling up uncontrollably. If not for considering Chu Wanning's pride, I would have visited her father long ago to confront. I took a deep breath and instinctively knocked. The trays on the table jumped slightly. Chu Wanning flinched in surprise, lifting her head to glance at me timidly. 2 teardrops unexpectedly fell down her cheek. After apologizing softly, Chu Wanning quickly raised her sleeve to wipe her tears. She then took the snacks out of the lunchbox and placed them back, pushing the tray back toward me. I was stunned. What are you doing now? Chu Wanning lowered her head. I'm already full. Thank you for giving me the food. I really appreciate it. To avoid me misunderstanding her, as Chu Wanning lifted her face and forced a smile uglier than crying. She knew my willingness to give was already kind enough. It was rude of her to think about giving it to someone else. I was almost amused by her behavior. I pushed the tray back to her. I didn't say you couldn't give it, but at least eat the chicken leg first, okay? Then give him the rest. Chu Wanning lowered her head and shook it slightly. I really can't eat any. This stubborn girl? Fine. There's nothing I can do about it. At this moment, I couldn't bring, after all, filial piety. If anyone's to blame, it's her father. So I adjusted my mood and said, fine. Let him eat it, I agree. Go pack the lunchbox. Chu Wanning quietly looked up at me. I forced a friendly and harmonious smile to show I didn't mind. Only then did she feel reassured and put the snacks back into the lunch. She then placed it in her. After getting up, Chu Wanning gave me a small bow and said thank you. With a blank expression, I silently repeated in my heart, don't say I'm a good person. Please don't say I'm a good. Chu Wanning didn't say it. Watching her leave the cafe, I let out a long sigh. If only she were my daughter, I thought to myself, and then let out a helpless chuckle. After leaving school, Chu Wanning didn't go home. Instead, she went to the school she had once attended. After crossing the street, she saw from a distance a middle-aged man. Sitting properly on his back was straight and his eyes were fixed on the school gate. He looked as though he was afraid of missing. Seeing this scene, a rare smile appeared on Chu Wanning's usually cold. She quickly ran toward him with her backpack. When the middle-aged man wasn't paying attention, she tiptoed, like a mischievous little girl, sneaking up behind him step by step. Then she quickly patted him on the shoulder. The middle-aged man turned around sharp, looked around, saw no one, and turned back. This time, the young girl's cheerful face suddenly appeared. Chu Wanning smiled and called out, Dad. Wan. The middle-aged man looked at and happily called her name. But he quickly stood up, lowering his head and apologizing. Dad didn't see Wan after school. I didn't see Wan after school, he repeated, his tone as childish as his fingers fidgeted nervously, twisting together as if unsure what to do. Chu Wanning quickly helped him sit back down, reassuring him. It's because I ran, so you didn't see me. The middle-aged man echoed, repeating them like a child. Chu Wanning looked at him with a gentle expression, then took out the lunchbox and cleaned chopsticks from. It's time to eat, she said. The middle-aged man swinging his legs like a child. Chu Wanning didn't rush to feed him but took out tissues and a water bottle. She poured water onto the tissue and then wiped the dirt and grime from his face. She scolded lightly. Why did you get your face? Wan, sorry, the man said with a pitiful. While wiping his face, Chu Wanning gently said, It's okay, Wan is not angry. After speaking, she opened and wrapped the chicken leg in a clean tissue. Chicken leg, the man said, but he didn't reach out to take. Instead, he anxiously urging her, Wan, eat, Wan, hurry and eat. The bad guys are coming. Following his tone, Chu Wanning said, I already ate. I had 2 already. Dad, you eat quickly. The bad guys are coming. After she picked up some rice with chopsticks. And at that moment, at the gate of Linan, Gumiaoyan came bouncing out. She was holding 2 freshly bought pineapples. Dad, do you think I can eat both of these? Should I save any for brother Xiaoze? Gu Yuandong scratched his nose. Be careful. If your brother finds out, he'll spank you. Gu Miaoyan let out a soft. She was about to cross the street, but she noticed the pretty lady was sitting with the man and having a meal. Gu Miaoyan stared for a moment, then smiled. She skipped over with her pineapple bun. Chu Wanning returned to class with her back. She found me, rare as it was, at my seat, reading and studying. She smiled and greeted me with a good afternoon. I turned my head and staring at her as if she were a ghost. Chu Wanning felt uneasy under my gaze. She avoided my eyes and asked what's wrong. I said, the sun must have risen in the west today. The cold and rude girl actually greeted me. Chu Wanning said nothing, looking flustered as she put down her back. She unzipped it and took out the text for the first class. I casually asked, Did your father enjoy the meal? Chu Wanning replied happily, Yes, he did. I turned to look at her, at the faint smile on her lips, and asked, So, is that why you're so happy this afternoon? Chu Wanning stared at me blankly, then slowly nodded after a while. I chuckled softly, not sure what else to say. But there was nothing else to say. I simply reminded her, After the evening, come with me. My dad's waiting for you there. He's the boss. He wants to interview. Hearing this, Chu Wanning turned to me, shocked. I raised an eyebrow. Don't be nervous. Though my dad's sharp, He's pretty easygoing. He won't make things hard for you. Chu Wanning finally let out it was her first interview. She really didn't know how to handle. Could it be she needed to recite trigonometric formulas to them? Chu Wanning softly asked, "Why do you talk about your dad like that?" I gave her a strange, "Not only will I'll talk about your dad too. Your dad is missing a few screws?" When a small but strong fist suddenly punched me hard in the chest. That punch really hurt. I looked at Chu Wanning in surprise. I saw tears welling up in her reddened eyes. Tears slowly gathered in the corners of her. Chu Wanning averted her gaze with a complicated, "Sorry." She apologized in an awkward silence. I rubbed my chest, took a deep breath, and said, "I'll apologize too. Sorry. I know you're filial. I shouldn't have talked about your dad." Chu Wanning turned her head away, not letting me see the tears stream. At that moment, her nose felt sore, and it was as if, with my words, all the grievances she had suppressed came pouring out of her heart all at once. The shadows of the past had weighed heavily on her, but Chu Wanning had never given up. She thought of herself as strong. She told herself to be strong, but when the boy beside her spoke words of comfort, Chu Wanning realized that she had always been pretending to be. At that moment, her facade of strength seemed to crumble completely. I couldn't help but say, "I really don't understand your family. If your dad has a special condition, then..." Chu Wanning immediately interrupted. "My dad is perfectly normal." I quickly shut my mouth, realizing she didn't want to discuss it any further. But if Chu Wanning is so protective of her dad, perhaps her dad isn't a scoundrel. Maybe he's bedridden for other reasons. But I can't figure it. This afternoon, during all four, Chu Wanning remained very quiet. I wanted to talk to her, but seeing her cold expression, I decided against it. During evening self-study, due to a power out, self-study ended earlier than usual. After packing her bag, Chu Wanning followed me to. Noticing her unnatural demeanor, I asked, "Are you nervous about the interview?" Chu Wanning looked at me and immediately I chuckled. "What's there to be? Just imagine my dad's head as a big rat. No matter what he says, just nod, smile, and say, 'Yes, that's all.'" She lowered her head, a small smile appearing on her lips. I loved seeing her smile. She looked so beautiful when she smiled. It was just a pity she always kept a. As we pushed the bike outside, I noticed her quietly walking with her backpack. I looked at her in surprise. "You're walking when there's a bike?" I patted the back seat of my bicycle as I spoke. Seeing the crowded school gate, Chu Wanning stood frozen in place. Her small hands nervously fiddled with her uniform. She stubbornly shook her head. "Shaking your head, what does that mean?" Before I could ask, Chu Wanning turned away shyly. She gripped her backpack straps and walked ahead, silent, walking. Watching students passing by one after another, I suddenly realized she might be feeling shy. After all, there were so many eyes at and if even one of them knew Chu Wanning and saw the cold face riding on the back seat of my bike, this would definitely become the talk of the school tomorrow. Thinking back to the time a girl had secretly pushed Chu Wanning off the steps, I couldn't help but berate myself. I'd been too careless. Chu Wanning had a certain reputation at school. If someone bullied her, there would surely be room. I slowed down my pace on purpose, pushing my bike. I kept a considerable distance behind Chu Wanning. Noticing this considerate gesture, Chu Wanning's tense heart gradually relaxed. We maintained a 10-20 meter distance, walking one behind the other. From time to time, to make sure I was still following, I tilted my head and smiled. Before long, there were no more students in sight. I got on my bike and rode up beside her. "Hop on now, no one will see us." Chu Wanning obediently walked around the bike. She tiptoed and sat sideways on the back seat. I teased her, "If you don't hold on to me, you're definitely going to fall off." Hearing this, Chu Wanning's long eyelashes fluttered. She hesitantly stretched out her pale, like a timid thief, lightly pinching the edge of my school. I sighed and started pedaling, but kept one hand ready to grab her if she fell. As the bike moved, Chu Wanning instantly lost her balance. With a startled, "Ah!" she quickly wrapped her arms tightly around my waist. Seeing she wasn't too stiff, I chuckled softly. I then placed my hand back on the handle. I casually said from the front, "See, nobody saw us. And there's nothing wrong with riding a bike and holding on, so what?" Chu Wanning lowered her head, her ears turning red. Numb with embarrassment. Barely, she could only maintain the hugging posture. If someone else had been riding maybe Chu Wanning wouldn't have cared so much, nor felt so awkward. But the person in front of her was me. After the initial shine, a rare, happy smile appeared on her lips. If only the world could stop at this moment, she wished silently in her heart. But Chu Wanning knew. Happiness can belong to anyone, but it will never belong to him. He is someone chosen by misfortune. It's been like this, and this is the song I hum softly. Riding my bicycle, leisurely heading toward the big supermarket. Chu Wan curiously looked up and asked, "What song are you?" "Never heard it before." "Really?" I tilted my head slightly. The pedaling of my bike slowed down. Only then did I remember. This song seems to have been released in 27, but it's only 2015. I chuckled softly, almost forgot that I was reborn. Being reborn, my first wish was to get into a good university. To make up for the regret of not attending, priorities must be set after being If you've been reborn, why spend all your a slave to money in the past life, only to repeat it in this life? What is the essence of being reborn? First, it gives you back your youth. Second, it provides opportunities to. The main purpose of my rebirth was to enjoy my youth. Of course, I can't not make money, but that can wait until after. Besides, my younger brother is. That's one reason I don't have to worry. If I could attend the same university as Chu Wanlin, it would be wonderful. But I think that might be wishful thinking. Chu Wanning's goal is undoubtedly Qing. When it comes to exams, the next monthly exam seating arrangement might be the only intersection between us. After the exam, Chu Wanning will return to the first seat in the first exam. Suddenly, I braked hard and stopped. Chu Wanning was startled. Her body bumped into my back. The softness on my back felt pleasant for a moment. Then I regained my composure. I looked solemnly at the red light at the intersection and declared with ambition to the girl, Chu Wanning, I won't be the last I will study hard. I don't want to sit in the last exam room anymore. I want to get into a good Passers-by by the zebra crossing turned, their eyes curiously focused on. The girl blushed and looked down. Her ears. I'll try my best to tutor you, she muttered. The light's green, let's go. Chu Wanning urged softly, almost breaking down. For the first time, she felt overwhelmed by my brazen behavior. After a detour, we finally arrived at the supermarket, named Four Seasons, was one of the largest in the Wangjiang Road, a sort of legendary. Chu Wanning got off, and I parked it at the end. I told her to wait outside while I went in first to The girl nodded obediently, but her fingers fidgeting with her sleeve betrayed her nervousness. She was about to meet not only the boss, but also my father. Even though she knew meeting my father had no real significance, she couldn't help but feel nervous. I entered the supermarket and saw my dad checking the shelves and jotting down notes. I yelled out loudly, startling my dad. What are you shouting for? Clearing my throat. I brought her here. Just give her don't ask too many questions, all right? My dad, intrigued, walked over excitedly. Let me see who it is. Who's the unlucky one whose studies will be disrupted? Guiyandong stepped outside. Chu Wanning immediately turned around at the entrance. Her long, curled eyelashes fluttered light, and she greeted nervously, Hello, uncle. My dad's face broke into. He forced a polite. Right after saying that, my dad quick and dragged me back into the You brat! Where did you bring such a pretty girl from? I thought it was a boy. Aren't you afraid her father will come? I laughed. She's my desk mate. My dad knocked me on the head. She looks like a proper young lady. How could she be short on money? Did you trick her or something? He took off his shoe, ready to. My muscle memory kicked in, and I dodged, twisting away while retorting. I didn't trick her. She volunteered. My dad, furious, stormed over. That's not okay. Send her away. Don't let her be the reason we lose this supermarket. With one swift kick, he sent me out. Standing at the entrance of I scratched my head awkwardly. Chu Wanning smiled shyly. Her pale hands clasped nervously and Goo, I'll head home now, she said softly. She lowered her head after speaking, an unnatural smile tugging. She turned and walked into the darkness. Her reaction surprised. I quickly caught up and grabbed her arm. Wait. The girl turned slightly, hiding her red eyes under her hair. She forced a very unnatural smile. It's getting late. If my dad doesn't see me, he'll worry. I'll head back now. She must have overheard the argument inside, though probably not clearly. She just knew that father and she had come here feeling both and expectant. But the moment she heard the argument, she instinctively blamed herself for I glanced back at the supermarket, but didn't let go of her arm. I said seriously, just wait a little longer. If you dare leave now, I won't go easy on you. Just as I was about to return to the supermarket, Chu Wanning quickly grabbed my arm. Her eyes red, she pleaded, don't argue. Her voice trembled. I froze for a moment, then smiled and reassured, a real man never solves problems with argument. After saying this, I kicked the door open. My dad, standing by the checkout, turned around and looked at me and, are you crazy? I raised 4 fingers, looking at my dad seriously. If you let her work here, I'll make it into the top 4 in the class in the next. Hearing this, my dad's anger faded and he looked at me with interest. Top 30? I raised an eyebrow in shock. Old man, you're tricked. Hearing this, my dad glared and reached for his. I quickly backed away tactically. Fine, top 35, then top 35. My dad finally snorted cold. If you can't get into the top 35, that girl has to leave. I mean what I say. You figure it out yourself. I forced a smile. There are 53 students in our. Getting into the top 35 means I have to improve by at least 5. It sounds exciting. Maybe I should cheat. I began brainstorming random strategies in my. Just as I was about to step out to call Chu, my dad's voice sounded from behind. He deliberately lowered his voice. the girl you like. I turned back, surprised. My dad gave me a sly look and said, with someone like you, even if you go this far for her, she'll never save yourself the trouble. I scoffed, ignoring him completely. My feelings have always been pure. I treat her like a younger sister. After stepping out, I heard my dad sigh softly behind me, but there was a smile on his face. At least he saw this. It's not bad to see this kid's great. He thought to himself. Chu Wan was obedient and didn't leave. However, instead of standing under, he was now standing in a dark corner. His figure looked thin and frail, lonely and isolated. I felt a bit still. I asked aloud, "Are you trying to laugh at me?" Chu Wanning quick. I was about to speak when I noticed the traces. He explained softly, "No, just now a customer came." So I stepped aside. I grabbed his arm and I brought him in front of my dad. "Follow me." My dad said, "The girl will." He glanced at Chu Wanning, obediently followed, taking out a notebook, ready to take notes seriously. My dad chuckled and said, "That's not necessary. There's nothing particularly important you need to do. And you can only come at night, right?" Chu Wanning nodded. "Yes." The two of them walked ahead, and I followed behind, looking at Chu Wanning's back. It was like looking at a well-behaved with a faint smile on my face. My dad instructed about the usual things she needed, although it wasn't much. Chu Wanning still earned, basically arranging items on the shelf, handling payments at the and cleaning up a bit when there for fresh meat. Make sure the refrigeration. I almost slipped while following behind, quickly steadying myself with a nearby. Looking down, I saw my dad and Chu Wanning both turn. My dad said angrily, "In the evening, some brat pulled down his pants and peed," quickly steadying myself. Then I looked down at a puddle of yellow liquid on the floor. My dad and Chu Wanning turned. My dad said irritably, "In the evening, some brat pulled down his pants and peed here." Then he turned to look at me. "You clean it up later." I glared at him. "Why don't you clean it yourself? Did you leave it here just to wait and clean it up?" My dad glared back at me and said, Then he turned around and continued. After walking around the store, the three of us returned to the cash. My dad put on his coat. "Teach your classmate how to handle payments. I'll head home first." After my dad left, I looked at Chu Wan, who was reading her notes near. "You can wander around for now. Familiarize yourself. I'll write down a list of things to note for you, including procedures and tasks." Chu Wan looked up and nodded gently. After a few minutes, I finished writing the notes. When I looked up, I saw my dad had returned again. "I forgot my bag," he muttered, and walked towards the shelves. I ignored him, but after a while, I noticed my dad standing still, staring in wonder. I quickly walked over. When I reached him, I was stunned too. Between two shelves, the girl was kneeling on the floor, using a rag she found somewhere to meticulously clean the puddle. Her back was quiet and silent, earnest and careful. She was doing what she thought she should do. My dad's expression softened as he watched. Then he quietly turned to me and asked in a low voice, "Who?" I took a deep breath and responded with a complicated feeling. Hearing this, my dad frowned and said, Why are you acting all mature in front of me?" But, of course, that he had found a good kid for the soup. As we returned inside, my dad cast aside, "If you don't make it to the top 35, he's out. No negotiation," he said, and left with his bag. I looked ahead at the girl kneeling and scrubbing. Hearing the sound behind, Chu Wanning turned her head. She slowly stood up, looking at me, and I tapped her forehead lightly. "Are you silly? Why scrub the floor with a rag when there's a mop?" Chu Wanning glanced at me with a slightly aggrieved. I only found the rag. I bent down and patted the dust off her knees. "You don't have to clean it yourself. There are other people in the supermarket." Chu Wanning shyly took a step back, lowering her head. "Uncle said we can clean when it's quiet at night." "You dare to talk back to me, huh?" I pointed at her with a serious Chu Wanning glanced up nervously, thinking I was going to tap her. Her neck instinctively shrank back, and she closed her eyes. Her long eyelashes trembled. But after a while, realizing I had, Chu Wanning cautiously opened. She then heard me say disdainfully, "Throw away. It's filthy." The girl blinked and asked, "Where?" I looked at her blankly. "On my face." Chu Wanning lowered her head, her cheeks turning red. She glanced around nervously, then gently placed the rag on the ground. Only then did I say, "Follow me." As we passed a small door, I pointed and said, "That's the broom. Wash your hands there first, then come to the cashier." After washing her hands, Chu Wanning, I was taking some cash out of the drawer. Looking at her, I extended my hand. Chu Wanning stared blankly. I had to explain. "It's a tradition in this. We pay the employees' wages. All employees here get this." She stared at me intently, her beautiful eyes seeming to see through. I tapped the table and pretended to. "What kind of look is that? Not enough?" Chu Wanning lowered. She softly said, "I don't want an advance." I tapped the table. "Are you defying the boss? Do you want me to fire you?" Chu Wanning's beautiful eyes calmly stared at. Her expression seemed to say, "Go. That's not threatening." I said slowly, "Should I tell my dad about what you did on the 30th? Hearing this, Chu Wanning's face turned. She quickly took the 500 yuan. I smiled and continued, you work fewer hours, so you get the lowest wage. It's just 500 yuan, but if you perform well, maybe you'll get a raise. I leaned forward, interlacing my fingers as I looked at the young. If you can use certain methods to please the boss, a raise might be negotiable. Hearing this, Chu Wanning's earlobes instantly turned red. She raised her other hand, clutching the 500 yuan. Her expression was a mix of nervousness. She knew I was teasing, but she was afraid I might have a hidden. What are you thinking? I stood up and sat on the counter, unable to resist ruffling her hair. I meant, you should smile more. That's also a way to please the boss. Got it? And also help me with tutoring. Chu Wanning immediately looked up. Her tone was serious. I will definitely tutor you. Of course, that's your job in the first place. Don't forget to come to my house this Saturday. If I don't see you there, I extended my claws playfully to scare her. Chu Wanning's ears. She pursed her lips and stayed. I sat back on the counter, pointing at the 500 yuan. So, how do you plan to spend your first paycheck? Chu Wanning seemed to realize something, quickly extending her hand. Here, I'll pay you back, she said. That's not what I meant. But at this moment, she still reached out to take. After agreeing, I noticed the girl's cheeks were red. She looked conflicted, as if she wanted to say something. Besides, your voice is soft. You politely asked for the change of 13. I was stunned for a moment, then burst. I almost forgot to give you your change. After giving back the 13.5 yuan, embarrassed, you bit your lip and handed me the change. Chu Wanning also extended both hands to accept. I teased her again, asking. Chu Wanning shook her head. Her pale face was as red as a tomato. I continued. What about the rest of the money? What are you planning to do? In 2015, for a high school student, holding 400 yuan was like having a small fortune. Chu Wanning seriously replied, 100 yuan. 100 yuan for exam. She paused after saying, it seemed she wasn't planning to, or maybe she hadn't decided yet. I reminded her, 50 yuan for the class. Chu Wanning looked up at me, stunned. Then she shook her head. I won't. I propped my hands on the counter, tilted my head back. Leisurely, I said, true. It's just for the opening ceremony of this. Why buy a useless out? But Chu Wanning, we only have one youth. Years later, I might regret not studying hard back then, and you might regret not wearing beautiful clothes to attend your last high school sports day. After saying that, I looked down at the beautiful girl. Chu Wanning turned her gaze away. She seemed to be quietly thinking. Seeing her still conflicted, I felt not frustration but pity. It's just 50 yuan. She seemed to be deciding with her. I suggested, how about this? Buy it first. After the sports event is over, sell it to me at an. Chu Wanning looked at me. At night, you looked at me. I earnestly reminded you, don't wash away the original. After returning home I saw my parents sitting in the living room, looking at me with subtle It was obvious that Dad had shared today's events with me. I walked from the director to the water dispenser. While drinking, I suddenly noticed my sister's door slight. Gu Miaoyun was waving at me from inside. Brother, I entered Gu Miaoyun's room. The little girl immediately pulled me to sit on the bed. What's wrong? Gu Miaoyun hugged my arm. Her little head rests on my shoulder. Brother, you're the best to me. In the previous life, I might have gotten goosebumps from this, but after being reborn, I just felt compared to the increasingly annoying Gu Miaoyun during her lowly phase was much cute. So, her acting spoiled and coquettish right now was quite endearing to me. What's the matter? Speak. Gu Miaoyun bit her lip shyly and said, Brother, can you come to my school tomorrow afternoon to attend? My expression changed, and I pinched her cheek to make her look up. What's going on exactly? Gu Miaoyun then looked aggrieved and admitted, I didn't make it to the top 20 last semester. If Mom finds out, she'll spank me. In this house, Dad only disciplined me, while Mom only disciplined Gu Miaoyun. The division of labor was extremely. I knocked on her head and said, I have classes. Just skip once, she said. You've skipped before. She fluttering her big eyes and, Brother, could you bear to see your sister get spanked? All right, but just this once, okay? You better actually study seriously. I have my own tasks too. Okay, brother, Gu Miaoyun happily rested her head. She happily rested her head on my arm, rubbing. I smiled helplessly. In this house, falsifying, that's why I've always been honest. Last place is just last place. During a gloomy recess, I saw Chu Wanning walking after getting the right size. She returned with 50 yuan. Xinyao glanced back, looking surprised. Chu Wanning is joining the girl leading the parade. Wouldn't they be replaced too? Xinyao turned back, frowning anxiously. After all, he had always been. Back then, when he was dazzlingly prominent. His personality made him especially enjoy being. If, in terms of looks or academics, he couldn't compete with her. Back at her seat, Chu Wanning suddenly whispered to me, I'm not selling. After saying that, Her earlobes turned red. She used the book to cover her delicate profile. I chuckled softly and continued reading. In the second class, Chu Wanning realized it was clear I took off my school uniform and put on a hoodie. Heading to the gates of Lunchtime, I bought 2 lollipops and walked toward the Gumiaoyan asked me until she came out to meet me. I figured it was a good time to catch up. Sitting by the greenbelt, I casually and kept one for myself. The uncle in suspenders happily. I was just about to catch up with the uncle in suspenders. I sat down next to the greenbelt. I casually handed him a lollipop. I kept one for myself. The uncle in suspenders happily accepted it and said, after turning around, he seemed stunned. Then he smiled in surprise. Little monk. I grinned. It was still the familiar nickname from back. I had kept a buzz cut since, so the uncle always called me Little Monk. It had been 2 years since we last, but he still recognized me. I couldn't help but ask, how many years have you been sitting? What exactly are you? He answered naively, waiting for Wanwan to finish. At that moment, an elderly voice came from behind. He's waiting for his daughter to finish, but he always forgets that his daughter is in high school now. I turned around and saw a sanitation worker. Grandpa, do you know him? I sat down and started chatting with him. The sanitation worker, Grandpa, and sat down beside me. Of course I know him. His family is so. Don't be fooled by his silly demeanor now. Back in the 90s, he was a big boss full of ambition. Very wealthy, he added. I looked at the uncle and said, the grandpa continued. He used to own a big company and managed hundreds of employees. His wife was a ballet dancer, as beautiful as a movie star. But then someone schemed. His company went bankrupt, and his family had to. As he said this, the grandpa, but his weathered smile carried a hint of. He had a son and a daughter. The family of 4, though poor, but one day, his wife was diagnosed with leukemia. She lasted a year before passing away. Hearing this, I fell silent. The grandpa continued. He kept living with his son and daughter. A few more years, but heaven seemed blind to his plight. Right before his son, he was hit by a car late at night. The young boy thought he was fine. The little boy thought he was fine. He took the 500 yuan compensation from the driver, but he died that very night. 500 yuan for a life. I could barely breathe. I silently turned to glance at the overall-clad man eating a lollipop. Tasty, tasty. He smiled innocently at me, waving the lollipop in his hand, happily stomping his feet. I suddenly remembered, didn't he have a daughter? The old man shook his head. The most pitiful one is still. When the family went bankrupt, the child, she never had a good day after she grew old. After her brother died, her father lost his mind. Not a little girl so young, going to school while taking care of her, and she looked after him so well. What a remarkable child. The old man raised his hand to indicate her height. I couldn't help but say, are you joking with me, old man? How could someone have such bad? The sanitation worker stood up and smiled at me. If you think I'm joking, it just shows you've lived quite a fortunate. Young man, there's still some cleaning left to do. Damn, talked so much and not even a cigarette. Muttering under his breath, the sanitation worker. I sat there silently, looking again at the overall-clad man, but the handsome man was nodding and swaying like a child. Tasty, really tasty. Lollipops are so tasty, he repeated. After a moment, I walked to the convenience store and bought a big. I placed it into the overall-clad man. As I stood up, I noticed Gu Miaoyun had already exited. She was waving at me. I took out my small mustache, pressed it against the scar on my face. I finished the parents' meeting when the evening classes ended. Luckily, Gu Miaoyun's homeroom teacher. The parents' meeting went quite well. Back in my second year of the teacher almost recognized me. Unexpected. When my sister said she didn't make it into the top 20, she meant she was in the top. No wonder she refused to tell our parents the truth. At the entrance of the class, I saw Chu Wanning just coming out of the office. Where did you go this afternoon? What were you doing in the office? We looked at each other, almost speaking at the same time. The sudden synchronicity made Chu Wanning slightly embarrassed. I smiled and answered, I was at my. What about you? What were you doing? Chu Wanning gently shook her head. Nothing. She said this and walked. I didn't ask further and followed her in. During evening self-study, I just focused on reading theoretical. Anyway, all the teachers had already given up on. After reading through the entire math review book, I closed the textbook and turned my gaze to the group of underachievers. Out of the 53 students, it meant I needed to surpass 18 of them to make it into the top, but I knew getting into the top 35 was far from my ultimate. In English, I had absolute confidence. I even believed my English could easily top. It was possible even Chu Wanming couldn't beat, but for other subjects, I really couldn't guarantee, especially for math and physics. I put down the book, walked out of the classroom, and when I came back, I suddenly realized her backpack was all. I asked the student sitting in front of me where. No idea. She just left with her backpack, and the teacher didn't. I looked up at our homeroom teacher and found Chinhui staring at me from the podium. She bent her right hand into pointed to her own eyes first, then pointed at me from a distance. I pursed my lips and lowered my head to continue. When the evening study session, I packed my bag and left. It seemed like Xinyao wanted to say something, but I walked away quickly. By the time he looked up, I rode my bike to the supermarket. I parked my bike at the entrance and walked. My dad looked at me curious. Don't you and that girl finish school at the same time? I was a bit surprised. She's here. I turned my head and saw Chu Wanning walking over with a broom, and when she saw me, Chu Wanning froze for a moment. Then she looked away, her expression a bit She turned to my dad. Uncle, should I throw away the empty bottle? My dad quickly sat up and nodded. Yes, just put them in the trash can outside. It was obvious. My dad's attitude towards the girl was Chu Wanming hesitated and said, but the bottles can be sold for. My dad laughed and waved his hand. How much money could they be worth? Just throw them. I frowned and slapped the table in front. Wasting is shameful. Every little bit adds up. I said, find a bag to collect the bottles. I directed the latter part of my sentence at the girl happily nodded and immediately went. My dad, unexpectedly scolded by his son, looked up, confused. Of all people, you're lecturing who's the biggest waster under the sun trying to teach me. I didn't reply. I just lowered my voice and muttered, that only earns 500 yuan a month, working like a slave. This supermarket is huge, and you let her clean it all by herself. My dad looked wronged and said, she volunteered to do it herself. It's not my fault. Honestly, it did sound like something that girl would do. I was speechless. My dad teased me. What's wrong? Feeling sorry for her? I glanced up at her. Then I placed my backpack on the counter and walked towards the busy Chu Wanming. I grabbed her arm and pulled her into a corner. Little did I, this entire scene was captured by my dad on the surface. He munched on sunflower seeds while watching the monitor with great interest. I cornered her against the wall, questioning her. Just to ask the homeroom to let you leave evening, is that it? And then you snuck out while I wasn't around. The girl bit her, unable to respond, only lower. Her small hands nervously gripped an empty nutrition. I snatched the bottle and slapped the wall behind her with my palm. Cat got your tongue? Speak up. Do you think working extra hours will get you a raise? I'm telling you, it won't happen. She looked up at me with tears and said in a small voice, evening classes end at 9 p.m. and I can clock out after 10. I only work an hour a day and still get 500 yuan. That's already too much. My brain pointing at Chu Wanming, I asked what other people's wages are. Chu Wanming looked up and I don't care how much I know mine is already too much. If yours is too much, she stared back at me, unflinching. I gritted my teeth in frustration. I couldn't out-argue her. I thought to myself, in the future, she'll probably drive me half mad. I couldn't bear to hit her, so I took a deep breath. Just don't let it affect you. Seeing me compromised, Chu Wanming smiled. She nodded enthusiastically. All right, go ahead, I said, turning my. Chu Wanming quickly snatched the empty bottle back. Her eyes sparkled with happiness as she shyly jogged away. Watching her retreating, I felt helpless. But time passed, and soon it was Friday. But I was still smiling. Time slowly passed, and soon it was when the evening self-study ended. Xinyao finally found an opportunity to stop me at the classroom door. Mu Shaozi, tomorrow is Saturday. Wang Mingyu invited a few people to his house. I agreed. You should come too. I impatiently replied. Go away, will you? I need to study tomorrow. Xinyao suddenly scolded, teared up, and watched my back as she cried loudly, study, study. Now everyone uses studying as an excuse. Keep being last, Gushao's. You'll never sit in the front row. I carried my bag and didn't look while Wang Mingyu walked over, mocking, don't bother with him. Losers are just losers. They're not in the same circle as us. No common ground at all. At 10 p.m., I locked the door of the supermarket. Afterward, I handed a note to Chu Wanning. This is my residential address and unit number. What time will you come tomorrow? Chu Wanning glanced at it and said, how about 1 p.m.? I nodded. I'll wait for you at home. Chu Wanning asked again, are you sure someone will be home? Of course. Why would I? Actually, I was lying. In the morning, my sister and mom might still be home. But in the afternoon, Gu Miaoyun has tutoring and mom has to work. But if I said no one would be home, Chu Wanning. Anyway, once he's there, if I lock the door, he can't leave. And really, it's not that serious. I just want to improve. Soon it was Saturday. Chu Wanning checked the time. We agreed on 1 p.m. yesterday, so he had to leave home after 12 p.m. Arriving at the address he looked up at the grand entrance of the community. For a moment, he felt lost, not knowing how to get in. He had never been to such a high-end place before. Someone swiped a card to open the side door of the community. He quickly tightened his grip on his back, lowered his head, and nervously followed behind. The security guard in the booth was watching. Afraid of being caught, Chu Wanning quickened his. On the other side, I woke up from bed, glanced at the time, and cursed softly. I quickly got up, rushed to the bathroom, and hastily washed. Then I quickly grabbed a t-shirt and put it on. Just as I finished dressing, the doorbell. I went to open the door and instinctively glanced at the clock. It was exactly 1 p.m. How punctual. The door opened, and I saw Chu Wanning standing nervously at the door. He seemed a bit shy. It was his first time visiting a boy's home. I smiled and said, "Why are you just come in?" Then I quickly grabbed 2 cups and ran to the kitchen to wash them. He stood at the door and gently asked, "Should I take off my shoes?" I came back to the living room and walked to the water dispenser. "Look at me, barefoot and comfy." Chu Wanning glanced at my barefooted stride and started bending down to untie his shoelaces and looked at Chu Wanning. "Let's go to my room." Chu Wanning quickly walked over, shyly looking at me. "Maybe I should greet your parents first, before we start tutoring." I paused for a moment, then seriously replied, "Actually, no one is home. It's just you and me now." Chu Wanning's beautiful eyes widened in surprise. "You lied." I sighed helpless. "I had no choice. In the morning there were people home, but you insisted on coming." Chu Wanning looked at me with a hint of resentment. "But my dad needs lunch at noon." I shrugged helplessly. "Then there's no other way." Though annoyed, Chu Wanning didn't turn and leave. Instead, his earlobes turned and he pouted like a puffer, standing sullenly before finally relenting. "Let's start." I pinched his cheek. "You're so cute when you're mad." Chu Wanning angrily raised his hand but I shamelessly dodged. This made his expression even more. After opening the bedroom, Chu Wanning's expression became visibly awkward. I placed the cups on the table and turned to ask, "Does my room smell?" Chu Wanning shook his head, though it was. I suddenly protested, "See? You don't think so either, but my mom and sister keep saying my room." Hearing this, Chu Wanning couldn't help but smile. Seeing him smile, I laughed and "That's just ridiculous. How could my room possibly smell?" Chu Wanning stepped further, but his fair foot bumped into the trash. He carefully lifted his foot. Seeing this, I quickly and explained, "Hey, don't misunderstand. The tissues in the trash can are just from blowing." Chu Wanning looked up, slightly confused. "Misunderstand?" I chuckled and said, "Nothing. Anyway, we're here to study, and we don't have much time this afternoon." I brought over 2 chairs and sat. It almost felt like we were deskmates again, except with just one desk. The distance between us was closer than at school. I could smell the clean fragrance on Chu. For someone who always wore a school uniform, he always smelled nice. I wondered if he washed his uniform because I had never seen it dirty. I took out my math practice problems. All I saw were red X's. A few questions I couldn't understand were circled. "Explain this to me." "Let's start with this question." "All right." Chu Wanning glanced at it and quickly came up with a solution. He patiently used a red pen to write the solution process while softly explaining. I nodded repeatedly and picked up the cup. Chu Wanning glanced at it and noted that I was holding the cup. 5 minutes later, Chu Wanning asked again, "Got it?" I nodded. This time I really understand. Chu Wanning finally smiled. He looked at the cups on the desk and noticed that the cups had been moved from side by side. I was focused on solving problems, clearly unaware of the change. Relying on memory, he picked up one of the cups and drank from it. I worked through the solution like this, right? Chu Wanning, holding the cup with both hands, leaned forward with a smile and nodded. "This girl always uses both, even to drink water. She cups the glass." I thought it was funny and very cute, but suddenly I froze. "Wait. You drank from the cup I used." Before I finished, Chu Wanning sprayed water. I closed my eyes. A moment later, I opened them helplessly and glanced down, only to find that my pants were so. I couldn't help but look up and comment, "Did you used to be a showerhead? The spray area is so wide." Chu Wanning, flustered and apologetic, said. He quickly stood up and pulled some tissues from the table. He cautiously approached and gently wiped my face with the tissue. I couldn't help but say, "It's not. So what if I drank from it first? Why do you dislike me so much?" Chu Wanning's face turned bright red as he quickly shook. I just, he stammered for a long time, but couldn't come up with a reason. The cheeks and earlobes were getting red. The water on my face was wiped. Chu Wanning quickly grabbed more tissue. She wiped downward along the neckline. When she reached the middle of my pants, she said, "Hey, where are you wiping?" Chu Wanning froze for a moment and realized. She quickly retracted her hand as if shocked. "You can do it yourself from here. I didn't touch that thing of yours just." She tried to explain nervously. "That thing of." I casually wiped twice with a tissue. When I looked up, I noticed Chu Wanning had turned her body to the side. She was facing the wall like. I threw the tissue into the trash. Chu Wanning then returned to her chair. She handed me the cup she accidentally. With both hands, I helplessly looked at her. Chu Wanning froze, her face blank. She quickly retracted, then pushed another cup on. She glanced at me for approval, and then shyly withdrew her gaze. I wiped my hair with a tissue. While observing her dejected expression, I felt that Chu Wanning was always. Was it just because I held her secret? Pondering the reason, I couldn't help but ask, "Chu Wanning, have we met before?" Chu Wanning lowered her head and silently. I looked at her suspiciously. "Really?" Chu Wanning shook her head again. "It's nothing. Let's keep studying." I waved my hand, and Chu Wanning turned. She continued where she had left off. It took about an hour. To finish 2 practice, my head felt a bit overloaded. I couldn't help shaking my head, rubbing my sore eyes. Science subjects truly are my life. I pulled out my backpack to grab my physics workbook. At that moment, Science subjects truly are my life. I took out my backpack to grab my physics. At that, my foot seemed to step on something soft and slippery. I looked down and saw Chu Wanling. She quickly retracted her small, fair foot, then covered the stepped-on foot with the all 10 pink toes. I looked up at her. Chu Wanling acted. She was seriously focusing on the exercise. These circled ones are what I don't understand. You look at them first. I'll go get some fruit. I placed the exercise and got up to leave. Soon I returned. The platter had various fruits and eat. Chu Wanling shook her head. You sit first. I sat down and started explaining the problems. While peeling an orange, I peeled half and ate it, then offered the next slice to Chu Wanling. Chu Wanling closed her mouth and stopped talking mid-explanation. In a commanding tone, I said, Chu Wanling looked up at me, opened her pink lips, bit the slice, and I laughed out loud. Blushing, she resumed explaining. Because here, the acceleration, I interrupted. Doesn't it change? Chu Wanling froze. Blushing, she corrected herself. It changes. I couldn't help laughing. And you forgot the concept of acceleration? Chu Wanling got I shook my head with a smile. I offered a Chu Wanling. I mischievously brought it. She still turned her head the other way. I raised my voice. Not listening, are you? Getting bold now, huh? Chu Wanling glared at me, opened her mouth and bit the orange slice. I teasingly brought it close to his mouth again. Chu Wanning still turned his head to the other side. I raised my voice slightly. Not listening, huh? Getting bold, aren't you? Believe it or not. Chu Wanning turned back and glared at me. He opened his little mouth, bit the orange, and ate it. I couldn't stop laughing. This trick always works. But Chu Wanning quickly stood up and started, You're not studying properly. I'm going home. I quickly pulled him back. Wait, I'm not teasing. As the evening approached, Chu Wanning walked to the door with his backpack. I called out to him again. Wait a moment, I said. I packed milk, fruits, and snacks from home and then I handed it to him. Chu Wanning, surprised, back. I don't want it, he said sternly. I don't need it as tutoring fees. Chu Wanning shook his head. No. After speaking, he quickly put on his I placed the bag outside, saying, Then Chu Wanning wanted to say something, but the door slammed shut with a bang. I looked at him through the peep. Chu Wanning stood at the door, then he looked at the door. Instinctively, a moment later, I looked again. I saw Chu Wanning had left. I thought he took the bag, but when I opened the door, I found the bag. I shook my head and sighed. This girl is so stubborn. Monday morning self-study session. Homeroom teacher Chin Hui. He announced two things. First, the grade supervisor thought our sports uniform had skirts that were too short. The whole class of boys gasped. The homeroom teacher continued, Don't worry, since it's the last sports meet in high school, the supervisor decided to girls just can't go bare-legged. They'll need to wear long socks. As soon as the whole class, sorry sir. I admit my reaction was a bit loud but the supervisor must enjoy the abs. Wang Mingju quipped. Girls, each of you owes me 5 yuan. At this moment, the homeroom teacher. I just checked the list of those buying class. This time for the girl holding the class sign will be Chu Wanning. Hearing this, Xinyao looked up. The class president, Wang Mingyu, suggested, Shouldn't we let the whole class vote on this? Chin Hui firmly rejected, no need. Xinyao slumped onto the desk and clutching a leaf tightly in frustration. Sitting in the back row, I raised my hands high and clapped. I support Chu Wanning for holding the sign. Unexpected, the responsibility of holding the sign made her uneasy. The homeroom teacher tapped the post. Second thing, after the sports, the exams will start immediately. The class, which was just suddenly became lifeless. Same as usual, 30 seating arrangements based on last. Speaking of this, the homeroom teacher leaned on his gaze, sweeping across the back rows of the classroom like a strict. Then, with a serious expression, he spoke, This is the first major exam for grade. Take it seriously. After the exam, those of you in the back, don't make your parents lose faith. Got it? I scoffed lightly. The homeroom teacher's gaze locked on. Do you have a problem with that? I smiled obediently. Chin Hui sneered. Don't act defiant. Let me remind you, at last semester, your father got so mad that he stormed out of the classroom and hit you. Do you remember that? The whole class burst. I chuckled sheepishly. But it does sound like something he'd do. The teacher quiet. He spoke earnestly. Gu Shaozi, put in some effort. Not asking you, but at least spare your dad some trouble. Just consider it as to avoid looking bad at the parent teacher. If you can move out of the bottom 10 in this, you'll be the one. The homeroom teacher gave me a thumbs up. After speaking, he left behind the cold 4 words, and the sound of quickly filled the entire class. But no matter how loud the sound was, on Monday night, Chu Wanning was going to become the girl who holds up. This matter quickly spread through the girls' dormitory. Like compared to the boys, Chu Wanning's reputation was even more famous among the girls. For boys, The louder and the more glamorous her appearance, the more they notice her. Except for girls like you who are very low-key, many boys have never even heard of her name, and they've never seen her. But the girls groups are naturally full of gossip. Whether you're high-key or low, you can't escape their discussions. Girls like Chu Wanning, and have an eccentric person, are almost always the hot topics. The afternoon PE class, the sports committee, Zhang Hao walked up to me with a notebook. Guxiaoze, how many events are you participating in? I spoke with no interest. 5 events: long jump, shot, 800 meters. These were all decided. He signed me up without asking. Every contract, has to contribute in other ways to the class. So he signed me up for. Zhang Hao sympathetically looked at me and said, got it. Go practice high jump first. I followed the direction and looked at the high jump facilities that were already set up. I walked towards them. Chu Wanning up above finally put down her book. I lifted my gaze and looked at the back of. It wasn't long before it was my turn at the high jump. I bent my body and gradually, as I reached the bar, I jumped. The height of my jump even stunned the PE teacher Wang Ping beside. This is the benefit of being reborn. I've gained a lot more strength. My jumping ability was during last week's dunking. But before I could land, my work pants suddenly got caught on the pole. Oh, damn. Chu Wanning on the steps watched, almost, but she quickly burst out. She hurriedly covered the lower half of her. I landed in a handstand position on this. My legs were lifted high because the pocket of my pants got. A few people quickly rushed over to help me. PE teacher Wang Ting smiled and said, Gu Xiao's, your jumping ability is impressive. It seems like adding half a me. I tugged at the corner of my mouth, looking at my already. Hold on a moment, let me take off my pants in the rain. I quickly yelled, everyone, Gu Xiaozi is taking off his pants. Song Xinyao's attention was drawn. Chu Wanning on the steps quietly covered her eyes. I laughed and swayed my head. Hey, didn't expect this, right? In my mind, after saying that, I wickedly took off, revealing the big shorts underneath. The rain instantly lost its. I looked at the broken pants without much thought. I walked towards the trash. I threw them into the trash. It seemed like I turned and looked at Chu Wanning. Then I laughed and left. Chu Wanning shyly, her beautiful eyes blinked slightly, as if she was thinking about something. As the bell neared, I grabbed the basketball and walked towards the court. When I looked up, I froze for a moment. I saw a girl on the step quietly approach. Chu Wanning was reading a book and had no idea that someone was. The girl's hands were already signaling. I suddenly shouted and immediately swung the basketball towards the girl. The basketball flew straight toward her and hit the girl's shoulder. It knocked her to the ground. I then sprinted up the steps. Chu Wanning quickly stood up, turned around with her book, and looked at the scene in surprise. I glared at her and said, didn't you feel someone? Chu Wanning looked a bit stunned, and while the girl, who had been sitting on the ground, held her shoulder in pain. I recognized her. She was also the girl who once led the bullying. I immediately walked up to her, slapped her face. The girl was slapped so hard that she looked at me in fear. I raised my hand, pointing at her. Which class are you in? What's your name? The scene quickly attracted all the people from class 28, including the PE teacher. A crowd surrounded the PE teacher looked at me and said, I ignored him. Turned around. Then I locked eyes with my. Come out, I said. Sun Hongyan reluctantly walked out. Then I asked, is this the one? The one who pushed Chu Wanning down? Sun Hongyan nodded. Yes, it's her. The PE teacher looked at this girl in surprise and furrowed. The PE teacher looked at the girl in surprise. He furrowed his brows seriously. I laughed. So it's you. You've come straight to me this time, huh? What's your name? Which class are you from? Sure. The girl still didn't speak. Though she was crying now, her eyes were filled with hatred. I wasn't going to go easy. I slapped her again. Didn't your mother teach you how to speak? The PE teacher couldn't watch anymore. He shouted angrily, Gu Xiaoze, calm down. If you keep hitting her, it'll be. I turned around and retorted, what do you mean by different? With such high steps, she just tried to push someone. Last time, she rolled down and sprained. What if this time she lands headfirst? Teacher, what would you do? This is attempted murder. My slap is already mild. The PE teacher was speechless in response. He also looked at the short-haired girl. He asked, which class are you from? Why are you doing this? Liu, a classmate, spoke up. She seems to be from class 5. I forgot her name. I sneered. I grabbed the short-haired girl by the collar and pushed through the crowd. I walked angrily in one direction. The PE teacher asked Gu Xiaoze, where are you taking her? I turned and shouted back, to the grade director's office. It's dismissed everyone. After school, the PE teacher looked at the students around. He commanded his colleagues, shouting, Chu Wanning, Sun Hongyan, you two come with me. Sun Hongyan reluctantly responded. Chu Wanning seemed to not realize her gaze was still fixed on my departing figure. The PE teacher shouted again, Chu Wanning! He walked in and then noticed that the pure and lovely girl was crying. Her tears flowed uncontrollably like a The PE teacher patted her shoulder and comforted her. The teacher will make the decision. Your classmates, Sun Hongyan and I, can also test. Chu Wanning wiped her tears. Wu Shengdi nodded. He hurriedly followed the gym teacher. I kicked open the door to the grade director's office. The noise startled Ji Richin, who was drinking tea. The tea splashed all over his face. Upon seeing who had, Ji Richin angrily slapped the table. What are you doing? I threw the short-haired girl I was holding forward. The girl landed on the floor with a thud. I clapped my hands, playing the role of bad. Ji Richin froze. He looked up and asked, what, do you think it's more exciting to break the... I said with a blank expression. How is attempted murder sent? Ji Richin was stunned again. Then he saw the gym teacher and the two girls walking in. I turned around and saw Chu Wanning crying. My frown deepened. I walked to a nearby desk, grabbed some tissues, and handed them to her. When the evening self-study bell rang, the grade director's voice came through the attention, there is an announcement. Class 15 senior grade has repeatedly harmed fellow students and has shown an extremely bad attitude. The parents have been notified. He is expelled from school. I sat in my seat, listening carefully to the broadcast. After talking about Shuyan's case, Girishin's voice continued. Now we will commend a student. This is unexpected. This student used to be frequently criticized, but now has turned. I never expected that he would reform and start anew. Look back now. The students in the back row looked with strange expression. This student courageously prevented a violent incident. He is Gu Xiaoze from class 28, seen a public commendation. At this moment, Chu Wanning was seriously. I didn't disturb him, and he continued reading. Noticing that I had left his, Chu Wanning's pen paused for him. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to. In the end, she refrained. The next evening, I watched Chu Wanning busily working in the. It felt a bit strange. The person who bullied her, she should be happy, right? But she seemed even quieter than before. When the supermarket closed at 10, I locked the door as usual. But Chu Wanning, standing nearby, didn't. Go home, be careful on the way. Chu Wanning stood there for a while, then took her backpack and brought it in front. She pulled out a neatly folded. I've fixed them. Chu Wanning handed. I took them stunned and looked at them. These were the pants I had thrown into the trash. I smiled in surprise and looked up at her. I was about to thank her. But Chu Wanning, her eyes, looked at me and said, thank you. But don't be so impulsive and don't let me almost get punished. She fought back tears and hurriedly turned. Her slender figure quickly disappeared into the thick night. I stood still for a while. Then I sighed deeply. I gently bent down and sniffed. I realized the pants had been washed. They smelled faintly of laundry. To Chu Wanning, if only I had known you early. I looked at the pants, murmuring softly. 1 week later, during the morning break, class monitor, Wang Mingyu, he raised his hand. Some of the boys, as soon as he finished speaking, the atmosphere shifted. Then the whole class instantly erupted in chatter. I turned my gaze. Chu Wanning also. We accidentally locked eyes for a moment. I turned my gaze back to my desk mate. Chu Wanning also just turned her gaze. We accidentally locked eyes for a moment. Then we both looked away. It felt like an invisible barrier appeared between. Ever since that night when she cried and Chu Wanning had kept. Of course, I understood her sense. She always thinks of herself. She worries that she might trouble those who are kind to her. But how could I be afraid of a reborn person? I took a deep breath, gripping the pen in my hand. At this moment, my mind was, her birthday is just a few. I've been thinking about what to get her as a gift. I don't even need to think. I know the answer. The last time she celebrated was probably when she was a child. And at this moment, the class uniforms were being, a large bag of them was placed on the podium by Wang Mingyu. Pick up your uniforms according to your. I turned to Chu Wanning. What size? I'll grab it for you. Chu Wanning gently shook her head, refusing. She stood up and walked over herself. What size? I'll get the 3X. Not long after, Chu Wanning returned with two. The two girls in the front row began discussing. What shoes go well? White sneakers, normal sports shoes. I think black leather shoes go best. Unfortunately, I don't have black leather. I overheard them. I knew Chu Wanning. I remember she only ever wore canvas. Does she have a birthday gift? But there was a serious problem that I had to face. That is, Chu Wanning's room is quite large. I can't just ask her direct. After all, I can't ask directly. After evening self-study ends, I can't just ask if this is a surprise for her. And I can't just ask about the towel. After evening self-study, Chu Wanning was standing in the sorting frozen meat in the card, holding a water. I sneaked up behind her like a thief. The lazy Wang Pengzi saw the little boss coming, was about to greet me, but then saw me motioning him to be quiet. Wang Pengzi obediently closed his. He glanced at Chu Wanning, knowing I was targeting her. I snuck up behind her. I pretended to accidentally tip over pouring the water onto Chu Wanning's canvas shoes. Afterward, I feigned shock and shouted, "Sorry." Chu Wanning jumped in surprise, hastily pulling her feet back. I quickly squatted down to untie her shoelace. "Quickly, take them. Hurry up and take. What if your feet get cold? I'll dry your shoes for you." "Don't thank me." Chu Wanning hurriedly pushed me. I ignored her and swiftly removed her shoes. I grabbed them in my hand, watching my back as I ran. Chu Wanning was holding the fridge, lifting her white socked foot was hanging lonely. She had a look of confusion and the lazy Wang Pengzi coughed off. He scratched his head in embarrassment, smiling as our little boss is always so enthusiastic. Chu Wanning was speechless. She clearly felt I was worried that Chu Wanning might. I ran out of the supermarket with the shoes. This scene left old dad sitting at the cashier, stunned. I reached the door of and, using the light, I opened the shoes. My smile faded when I saw the size had already become unclear. It made sense. These shoes must have been bought a long time ago. It's no wonder the printed size was no longer clear. I returned to the cashier area, leaning against the wall. I picked up the hairdryer and started blowing the child turned her head and noticed that her dad. I casually asked, "Can you tell what size this shoe is?" My dad glanced at it and said less than. I was speechless. Obviously, after drying it, I took the shoe back to the fresh. Chu Wanning was leaning against the fridge, sitting on a bench. It was obviously the chubby Wang who kindly brought. When she saw me, she hurriedly stood up and said, "I dried. I'm so sorry. I accidentally got your shoes wet." Chu Wanning gave me a confused look, stretching out her hand but I didn't give them to. I stared at the girl's white sock, frowning deeply. I nervously spoke, "Your feet are quite special." The customer asked Wang to chop, but Wang didn't respond. He didn't. His attention was completely drawn to the scene over. He was curious. What exactly was the little boss selling? Chu Wanning immediately looked at me warily. "What are you going to do?" I cleared my throat and said, "To be honest, I recently learned how to read palmist. I thought the same principle applies to feet." She shyly said, "You want to take?" I squatted down. "Not necessary. I can still see." I said confidently. I stretched and gently held Chu Wanning's foot in front. I extended my thumb and index finger, measuring the size of her sole. Chu Wanning tried to retract her foot, but couldn't because my arm was too strong. She was experiencing for the first what it felt like to not be able to. Once done measuring, I returned her shoes to her, leaving her with a parting remark. "You're destined for good. Enjoy the happiness." She glared at my back with flushed ears, angrily looking down while putting on. After returning home, I didn't want to forget. I dropped my bag and quickly went to my sister. Gu Miaoyun was sitting cross-legged on the bed reading. When she saw someone, she hurriedly put the comic away. When she saw it was me, she relaxed. She looked at me unhappily and asked. I rushed over and asked, "What size are your feet?" Gu Miaoyun was puzzled. "Why is my brother asking about this?" The next moment, she screamed in surprise. I lifted one of her legs with one hand, bringing her soft white feet close to my face. I began measuring the size with Gushao's, you pervert. Pervert, stop playing. Dad, help me. Suddenly, there was a noise. I turned around and saw it, my hand holding the clothes rack coming. "Gu Xiaoze, have you lost your—" "She's your sister." Gu Miaoyun was upside down, her upside-down face looking at Dad with a— "Dad, help me," I calmly murmured. "It's a little bit too big. Her foot size is—" After saying this, I let go of Gu Miaoyun. I seemed to be lost in my own world, muttering something quietly. With my dad looking confused, I calmly walked out of Gu Miaoyun. "Dad, my brother's a pervert." Gu Miaoyun sat on the bed, looking at Dad with a wronged expression. My dad with a serious look. "Don't worry, I'll beat him up later." In the living room, "What? Are you planning to give her shoes as a gift?" I said seriously, "Yeah." "Dad, please help me in 2 days." 2 days later, I arrived at the class. Since it was a clear day earlier, the night sky outside the classroom window was sparkling with stars. Appearing peaceful, Chu Wanning stared out the window, imagining that 2 angels would suddenly smiling at her. And smile at her. One was Mom, and the other was Brother. She gazed at the night sky for a— Chu Wanning withdrew her gaze. She lowered her. She slowly wrote 7 characters on the draft paper. "Happy birthday, Chu Wanning." Looking at these sharp and graceful characters, Chu Wanning smiled slightly. She blew lightly on her fingertips, as if a candle were standing on them. Chu Wanning stared blankly. When she snapped back, she quickly used a black pen to rapidly cross out the set. She turned her head and looked at the empty. Gu Xiaoze skipped evening study again. Chu Wanning took a deep breath. She lowered her head and continued writing. When the designated time came, she packed her bag and left the classroom. The classmates in the class used to her leaving at this time. It was a privilege given by the doubles. Chu Wanning walked alone on the night, blowing in the cool night. Her last birthday was spent in the hospital. The memory was already blurred. She only remembered her mom, with all her hair, wearing a blue striped hospital gown, sitting, but her eyes still looked at her 5-year-old self and gently clapping, saying, "Happy birthday to you." Her 10-year-old brother walked over holding placing it on her dad, who hadn't had time to change out of his dirty, but that didn't affect his. He gently placed a candle on the cake, lighting the wick. He softly rubbed his daughter's head with his hand. Make a wish. 5-year-old Chu Wanning, with her little hand, innocently said, I wish. I hope Mom's hair will grow back tomorrow. She lay on the edge of the bed, smiling innocently. The woman with a tired face suddenly looked. Upon hearing these words, she immediately, with a reluctant expression, choking up, she said, silly child, your wish can't be spoken out loud. If you say it, it won't come true. Chu Wanning walked alone in the night. Her hands were clasped. She looked at the stars in the night, making a wish that only she could hear. She wished because her mother had told her that wishes cannot be spoken. If you say it, it won't come true. Her wish did not come true. Her mother's hair still never grew back. When little Wanning used her saved New Year money to buy a wig, her mother closed her eyes. Little Wanning still put the wig on her mother because she knew her mom loved. At this moment, the green Chu Wanning crossed Wangjiang East, heading towards the Shishi Shengshan supermarket. When she looked up at the supermarket entrance, she suddenly froze. It was as if she had entered a pair. The entire supermarket was, but the supermarket door was wide open. She quickened her pace, running toward the supermarket entrance. She placed her backpack on the checkout and hesitantly shouted, Is anyone here? Is anyone here? Her voice echoed through the empty supermarket. The supermarket was dark, but strangely, behind one of the shelves, there was red and white light flickering. Who's there? Chu Wanning shouted loud. She walked a few steps in the dark, and suddenly, the supermarket door slammed shut behind her. Chu Wanning quickly turned around, panic-stricken, as she stared at as she gasped for breath. The white light in the darkness began to sway more intensely. It was like an angel emerging from behind the shelves, and it was accompanied by a familiar, beautiful voice singing, Happy birthday to you. I, who suffer from nyctophobia. 2 large flashlights were tied. The person with a unique appearance slowly emerged, carrying the candle flames on the cake flickered, casting a gentle smile on the happy birthday song gradually. Behind me was Wang, who was chopping meat. Li, weighing vegetables in the vegetable section. Song, weighing snacks, and my dad, who was secretly appeared at the supermarket entrance. He, like everyone else, was singing the offbeat happy birthday to you. And exchanged a distant look with Chu Wanning. Happy 17th birthday. After singing, I stopped and looked at Chu Wanning. She gazed back at me, smiling. Happy 17th birthday. I slightly tilted my head, smiling. Chu Wanning looked direct. Tears uncontrollably flowed from her eyes, from the corner of her eyes down her face. At that moment, it was me in front of her. 17-year-old Chu. Actually, wishes really do come true when you make in the dark supermarket. The flashlight and my dad came from behind and gently placed a paper on the girl's head. Not bad, looks good, he smiled, giving his comment. Suddenly noticing, he walked around to have and found that Chu Wanning was crying like is she really that moved? My dad was. The plot my son designed was indeed to cooperate with me. The supermarket closed. It must have lost several thousand in sales. But my dad didn't mind. Although Chu Wanning had only worked, at least several thousand in sales were lost. But my dad didn't mind. Although Chu Wanning had only worked for him, but just because this girl was willing to sew pants for his son, my dad thought it was worth it. So he even sponsored a luxurious, you little brat, so romantic, are you trying to, look, you made the girl cry. Hearing my dad scold me, Chu Wanning hurriedly turned, quickly wiping away her tears. As if proving she wasn't crying, my dad was amused by the girl's. He handed her a tissue, joking with, he didn't scold her. But you're crying, I feel a bit heartbroken. I didn't expect. The more Chu Wanning cried, the more I realized. I decided to make a wish for her. Except that you took a few steps forward. I already made a wish. Without asking, blowing out the candles made the wish count. Chu Wanning immediately nodded. She ran up and blew, but apologetically she looked at me. Just as she was about to continue, my dad called from behind. I smiled at Chu Wanning. Don't mind if I interfere with. Chu Wanning shook her head like a rat. We both puffed our cheeks and leaned over, blowing the candle flames back and forth until the flames extinguished in the supermarket lights. Everything became brightly lit. At this point I spoke, you older folks eat less sweets at night. Just a few pieces, that's enough. Let our birthday girl take the rest home. Her family hasn't had any yet. Chu Wanning quickly waved her. You guys eat, you guys eat. Her voice became small because she could hardly imagine how much money it would take such a big, beautiful cake. I started to divide the cake. I directly handed the first piece to then picked up the spatula and gently rubbed it on the tip of Chu Wan, watching as the cream stuck to the tip of her nose. With her shy, blinking expression, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. What are you waiting for? Chu Wanning low, enjoying the sweet cream while nervously asking softly, how much is this cake? Just as my dad was about to speak, it's from a promotion at the bakery. They said on September 19th. I just casually entered. Unexpectedly, I won a 2-layer lemon. It sounds pretty surprising. Is there such a way to get something for free? He asked where the bakery was. I turned to look at him. You're not planning to go and try your luck I forgot the name, I answered casually. My dad, while eating the cake, had a subtle, without exposing me. A few of us were happily chatting. The atmosphere was extremely harmonious. I turned to look at him and Chu Wanning was immersed, licking the cream off the spoon. When she saw me looking at her, she quickly tucked her tongue away, her earlobes turning red as my dad said, Wanning, thanks, uncle. Chu Wanning smiled and replied. Without any awkwardness, her expression I took the remaining half of the birthday cake and walked with Chu Wanning to give it to her. Chu Wanning took the cake from me. Noticing I wasn't hurrying, she pulled out my backpack from the front and started to unzip, then suddenly paused. She hurriedly pointed behind me. Hey, what is that? She brought my backpack in front of her again, zipped it open, but suddenly froze. She quickly pointed behind Chu Wan. Hey, what is that? Chu Wanning quickly turned her, but saw nothing. Confused, she turned back. At that moment, a pair of shiny, ta-da, birthday gift. Heh. I shook my head. Chu Wanning was stunned again. She looked at the clear sun and remembered the strange actions I had made. The light from the street lamp cast a dim and hazy glow over. I smiled widely. Quickly reaching out, what's going? I really can't believe. I wiped the tears off Chu Wanning's face with my. Are you made of tears? I helplessly asked, but in fact, Chu Wanning rarely cried. Over the years, her tears seemed to have been saved because of me, the person who, without warning, how much is this? Chu Wanning choked. Her words were unclear. I waved my hand. It's just I saw it on the road and bought it. Chu Wanning raised her head. I couldn't tell her it cost 500 yuan, so I just said, since it's a birthday, don't treat me like an outsider. For my birthday, you also have to give me a. Chu Wanning lowered her gaze and she hesitated, but before I could respond, I looked at her. You know it's my birthday? Chu Wanning quickly panicked. I don't know. I didn't understand how she knew. Anyway, just give me a gift for my birthday next year. Isn't that how it works, mutual exchange? Chu Wanning lowered her head, blushing slightly. She turned her. It seemed like she remembered something. She stopped and said, Gu Xiaoze. Can you pick me up tomorrow morning? Chu Wanning lowered her head and gently. He turned around, ready to go home. It seemed like he remembered. He stopped and said to me, Gu Xiaoze, can you pick me up for school tomorrow morning? Wait for me at the entrance of Gi. Tomorrow is the sports. In the morning, there's a sports day requiring all school classes so every student needs to wear their class uniform and head to the classroom since Chu Wanning doesn't live on, he has to wear his class uniform at home. He probably doesn't want to be stared at by passersby. I immediately understood Smiling, I agreed. Sure. Chu Wanning also smiled. Thank you. How about 7:30 The next morning, I was woken up by my 7 o'clock alarm. After quickly freshening up, I left home. I rode my bike to the agreed meeting point. I glanced at my watch. It was already close to 7:30. Soon, Chu Wanning arrived at the alley entrance. I looked at him curiously. Where's your class uniform? Chu Wanning replied awkwardly. It's under my school uniform. I looked down at Chu Wanning. The thigh area of his school uniform pants seemed that part was probably the skirt. However, he was still wearing canvas shoes. Before I could ask, he immediately explained, the leather shoe. All right, get on. This guy was already wrapped in his school uniform. Wasn't it unnecessary? I thought amusedly. We parted ways a few hundred meters away from I rode into the campus first. Wearing my uniform, I walked into the girls discussing something all turned around. They stole quick glances, looking me up and down in a flash, then quickly huddled together again, whispering among themselves. I didn't know what they said, but a few of them stomped their feet. Thick-skinned, I leaned close. Never thought. Gu Xiaoze looks quite handsome in his uniform. He's tall and well-built. Clothes look good on him. He's probably the most muscular guy in our class. I couldn't help but ask, what's so good? The girls immediately turned around, blushing and pushing me away. What's a guy like you, Eves? Get lost. At that moment, Chu Wanning walked. The girls turned their heads to look again, eyeing him with curiosity. Why isn't he wearing his uniform? Chu Wanning ignored everyone, quietly walked to his seat, put down his school bag, picked up the class sign nearby, and started practicing at the back of the class. He looked very serious and didn't act awkward, just because I averted my gaze and sat. The opening ceremony was scheduled for 9 a.m., so students arrived later than usual today. Originally, the boys were excited, but after wearing them, they became shy and aloof. After a while, more and more people started arriving. The class chat gradually grew louder. Xinyao entered the classroom surrounded. This scene instantly caught a lot of attention. After entering the class, Xinyao, his eyes lit up, but he quickly averted his gaze on purpose, flipping his hair casually. Xinyao thought I'd definitely sneak a look, so he didn't bother to greet me. Although he'd been ignored for half a month and really wanted to talk to me, he maintained his composure. I didn't even glance at him. Before my rebirth, I'd seen plenty of Xinyao was just one of the most ordinary among countless mediocre ones. Soon, people started arriving in groups. Chu Wanning finished and put the class sign back in. It was obvious he was a little nervous, sitting quietly and taking deep breaths. At this moment, the class teacher walked into the classroom and tapped the podium. The teacher tapped the podium. Everyone, get ready and put on your class. When the music starts, head downstairs together. Wang Mingyu stood up and shouted loudly, anyone who hasn't changed yet, hurry. There are only a few minutes left. Hearing this, Chu reached for the zipper of his school and pulled it down. His full chest under the white shirt immediately peeked through the opening. Instinctively, I stood at attention. Why are you staring? Chu Wanning said, his earlobes turned. He had obviously noticed my gaze long ago. Without thinking, I replied, Chu Wanning's face also turned. He handed me his jacket. Hold this for me. Then he reached into his pants, adjusting the hem of his skirt to avoid any mishaps. While after finishing, he removed his pants. A pair of smooth, fair thighs appeared. His skin was so flawless that Stop staring! His earlobes turned as red as he pressed the hem of his skirt firmly between his, whispering softly for me to stop. I replied confidently, Didn't you ask me to? Chu Wanning had no words and continued changing his uniform. He bent down to pick up his canvas shoes. I smiled and said to him, By the way, I have a 3,000-meter run this morning. Will you wait for me at the finish line? I'll definitely be exhausted. You're my only friend, after all. Without hesitation, Chu Wanning nodded. He removed his canvas shoes and took a pair of black leather shoes out of his bag. He placed them gently on. His feet slowly slid into the shoes. I found the scene oddly pleasing. Chu Wanning opened his bag again and took out a pink hair clip. He clipped it onto his bangs without much thought. Then he turned to look at me. I couldn't help but smile. I adjusted the clip for him. Then with some curiosity, you seem a bit different today. Today, it felt like Chu Wanning was actively layer after layer of disguise, revealing his truth. Chu Wanning didn't answer. Instead, he bent down and grabbed, as if holding the gunstock of youth. He looked up, slightly pursing his lips, and said, Youth only happens once. I want to try my best too, so my future self won't have regrets. He thought he couldn't do it at first, but after last night, he realized that if someone could even celebrate something he thought would never happen, then perhaps he could try to put a bit more effort into other things. He wanted to live up to. He didn't want his beautiful black and pink hair clip to gather dust. The music started playing. The homeroom teacher walked into the classroom and said, Get ready to gather. Chu Wanning grabbed the class sign. Today you're the face of senior class 28. Everyone turned to look toward the back. What was supposed to be a cat turned into one frozen gaze after another. Damn, Liu exclaimed, his mouth gaping in surprise. Xinyao looked shocked. The other classmates were similarly stunned. Everyone knew Chu Wanning was good look, but they would always subconsciously forget her existence because she was too low-key, always wearing the same school, always saying little, always keeping a cool but today she was different. Her hairstyle and outfit had transforming her into someone new. She was now dazzling like a star. Even though she was still it felt like a fundamental change had occurred. In the back corner by the window, Chu Wanning stood up, placing the class sign on her. Noticing everyone's gaze, she quietly lowered her head. Carrying the class sign, she walked to the. As she walked, she couldn't help but glance back out of. Noticing me following. He finally felt a little more. Wang Mingju snapped out of it and said, Let's go. Everyone, head downstairs and gather together. In front of Xinyao, he couldn't help but glance towards the bowl of mud nearby. Only then, with his heart racing, Chu Wanning was truly beautiful. Everyone went downstairs to get. Walking among the crowd, Chu Wanning felt very. He kept paying attention to my. When he saw he slowed his pace. Only when I was behind him did he start walking at a normal pace. I quietly asked him next to me, Are you nervous? Chu Wanning nodded. What he was holding in his arms, but his sense of security. The dress wasn't even that short, but Chu Wanning kept wanting to pull it down. The gazes around him made him uncomfortable. More and more people were casting glances at him, even though they were all amazed and admired. To Chu Wanning, These gazes were like dazzling, blinding flashes of light. They made him feel extremely uneasy. He was so used to social that even the appreciation from strangers became. I noticed his discomfort. I tried to comfort him. Be confident, don't be nervous. Chu Wanning nodded, but I knew he hadn't really taken it in. I reassured him again. When you always perform to your usual standard. Why aren't you nervous then? It's different, Chu Wanning softly retorted. I chuckled. It's all the same. Today is also an exam, a test on the theme of youth. Walk the 100 meters of youth with the plaque and you'll score 100. Do you believe? Chu Wanning looked up in the direction I pointed. It was the track below the podium on the field, the same route every formation would take. I looked down at his shoes. Walking in the shoes I gave you as a birth, isn't that enough to give you courage? I didn't know, but I said something that carried for Chu Wanning. Chu Wanning turned to look, his beautiful eyes reflecting my face. Gradually, his gaze became more resolute. I smiled at him and said, take a deep breath and go for it. Chu Wanning nodded, obediently standing there. His chest rose as he breathed in. I glanced down at his chest as he exhaled, and his chest slowly fell. It was captivating. Chu Wanning tightly gripped the class placard, and the surrounding gazes kept focusing on him. In my eyes, Chu Wanning, holding the class, was taking steps out of the shadows. He stood in the queue as planned. I observed the formations from this vantage point, all kinds of quirky lab coats, hospital gowns, even Calabash Brothers costumes. By comparison, our class uniforms seemed ridiculously normal. Ahead of us, some were dressed in Hogwarts robes. Because I was taller, I stood in the last row of the formation. I noticed Chu Wanning standing at with the class teacher. Chu Wanning had his head lowered. Seemingly, at that moment, he turned his head as if searching for something. When he spotted me in the back row, he turned his head back. The marching music on the field continued, and the host's voice, amplified, spread across the field. Things were already underway. I waited idly in my spot. Suddenly, a commotion arose in the front. The people in the front row stepped aside, as if making way for someone. I turned my head to. I then realized it was Chu Wanning. She squeezed and was heading towards the back rows. Chu Wanning had her earlobes flushed under the gaze of the entire class. She walked straight and stopped. Chu Wanning said nothing, not even looking up at me. She directly reached out her fair and grabbed my wrist. Then turning around, she pulled me back into the lineup, bringing me to the very front. Everyone was stunned. No one could figure out what the normally quiet and cold, beautiful girl was trying. The front row was filled with bright, and there I stood, a tall guy, awkward and sticking out like a crane. At that moment, I also felt a little, so I quietly asked Chu Wanning, "What are you doing?" Chu Wanning hugged the class placard and said, keeping her head down and remaining silent. Our class teacher, Chin Hui, gave an awkward and couldn't help but ask, "What's the meaning of dragging this guy over?" But Chu Wanning still kept her head, refusing to say it. The class teacher glanced at me while I raised my eyebrow, pretending not to care. "Why are you still staying? Go back already." The class teacher rolled her eyes and ordered me. I nonchalantly raised my hand and turned. But just as I took one, the silent Chu Wanning, still with her head down, grabbed my arm, stopping me. Xinyao and a group of girls watched. Even the class teacher looked over it, unable to understand what the girl was trying to explain. Seeing the class teacher rendered speech, I smiled smugly and said, "Look, it's not that I don't, it's that she won't let me." The class teacher glared at me fiercely, but when facing Chu Wanning, his expression softened again. He smiled and asked, "Do you want Gu Shaoze to stand in the front row?" Chu Wanning still didn't speak, but her small hand continued to grip my wrist, refusing to let go. The entire class knew her eccentric, so this odd behavior actually fit her character. The class teacher was helpless. His favoritism toward Chu Wanning was well known. He immediately turned and ordered, "Gu Shaoze, take your place." I reacted in stunned disbelief. The class teacher adjusted his glasses and sternly added, "Say one more and we'll see. Stand there when what's with all the nonsense?" Reluctantly, Chu Wanning finally let go of my. The class teacher laughed in exasperation. "If you wanted Gu Shaoze in the front row, you could have just said something. Do you think I'd refuse?" I smiled and squeezed into standing right in the middle of the girls. Surrounded by girls, I was the only guy standing tall there. It was as if our whole formation was flipping off the crowd. The boys in the back row were practically gnashing when they saw Chu Wanning pulling me early. They were dumbfounded. When did these two get so close? Xinyao was also in the. She voiced her dissatisfaction. "Teach, why does Gu Shao's guy get to stand among us girls?" Thinking about Chu Wanning's earlier action, a nameless anger rose in her chest. Now seeing me in the front row, the more she looked, the class teacher turned to her and said, "Because I'm." Xinyao stomped her foot in frustration, confirming that I was right. Chu Wanning let out a soft breath, then turned around while holding the class. She didn't want to face this test of youth. It was something for. I said something wrong. In his heart, only with me by his. Could this exam be called youth? Looking back years later, there would be no regret. The hand that held tightly onto mine symbolized his determination. After waiting for about half an hour, it was finally our class's turn. Chu Wanning picked up the class sign and followed behind. Then we stopped again at the 100-meter starting. The entire 27th class, dressed in Hogwarts uniforms, walked to the stage and stopped. Without any warning, this group set to face the field. They pulled out magic wands from their cloak, drawing a circle in the air at a 45-degree angle, and then putting them back into their The crowd erupted into enthusiastic. The more stunts the class performed, the more excited the audience became. However, our homeroom teacher didn't like our class, so the 28th class's formation last year was Next up was the 28th class of senior year, led by the homeroom. Under the leadership of the homeroom teacher, the 20 had achieved success every year. The announcer on the stage began the introduction. The teacher softly, let's go, show some. Chu Wanning picked up her fair, slender arms, crossed and held. She stepped forward, her long legs wrapped in shiny black leather shoes, stepped on the as she walked out. All 27 classes on the field focused their eyes on the girl. They neither cheered nor applauded, but simply as if in awe of her appearance. The 28th class, did they bring in some heavenly reinforcement to hold the sign? Because he was so beautiful, it felt like he came truly. Many people started turning to their classmates, confused. They asked who this beautiful girl they'd never seen at school before, where she came from, and what her name was. All the ones asking were because Chu Wanning was already quite famous among. As the formation gradually reached Chu Wanning, holding the sign, even the 28th class sign in her hands, seemed to become more prestigious. As more and more gazes gathered, Chu Wanning's heart began to race. She had never been stared at by so. Although I gave her a sense of security from behind, it couldn't fully shield her from the pressure of. I noticed that Chu Wanning was struggling to hold the class signs. As we reached the stage area, a loud voice suddenly came from behind. Hello, everyone. Great work, everyone. Hearing this voice, Chu Wanning froze, then smiled and let out a breath, as if she had come back to life. Her arms steadied, and the drooping class sign was lifted again. My shout drew all the gazes focused on her, to myself instead. The homeroom teacher turned to see me waving, enthusiastically greeting the people on the field. Her smile froze on her face, but she couldn't do anything about it now, and could only watch helplessly as people started noticing the tall boy standing among the girls. They smiled with amused expression, and many loudly responded, not tired at all. I shouted back, what do you mean not tired? Are your assignments too light? Teachers, take a look. Pay special attention to this class. The head of the senior year looked at me with a dark expression. He even glanced at the principal's reaction. Seeing the principal smiling, he inexplicably let out. The homeroom teacher, however, embarrassed and wishing to disappoint. But the slightly humorous, distant exchange, combined with the unexpected boy among the brought a round of applause to the 28th class's formation. However, within this was undoubtedly admiration for the girl. I was merely the spark for the applause. After smoothly complete, the 28th class gathered at their designated. Chu Wanning stood at the front holding the sign, while the boys and girls split into two lines behind. I was still the first person in the girls' line. The homeroom teacher's gritted teeth sounded next to me. We'll deal with this after the event. I smiled and calmly replied, Teach, I have a 3,000-meter. Don't pressure me. My composed response left the teacher. The 30-something woman, as if changing face, instantly switched to a smile, lightly patting my shoulder. She encouraged me, oh, really? Gu, you have an event this morning? Run well. Teacher was just joking with you earlier. I couldn't help but nod with a chuckle, thinking, she'll deal with me after. She was a woman who wanted to win. The reason she doted on Chu Wanning was because Chu Wanning could, single-handedly, raise the average score of the entire by 7 or 8 points. I heard that during last semester's finals, and the 28th class dropped out of the top 3 in the grade since the start of this semester, Jinhui had been quietly enduring in the office, waiting for this. She hadn't spoken to any other teachers, just biding her time for this month's exam. After the opening ceremony, I went back to the classroom to change into preparing for the 3,000-meter run. Chu Wanning, meanwhile, walked towards the campus. That 1-minute formation showcase had completely turned her into a superstar. This is no exaggeration. If the internet back then had been more developed, the video of Chu Wanning holding this would definitely have gone viral on major. While walking towards the campus store, Chu Wanning felt more and more eyes focusing on him. There were even small groups of people following behind him, quietly discussing like obsessive fans. Chu Wanning ignored all the gazes and just walked with his head down, as if around him he could even hear clear conversation reaching his ears. Among the chatter, he even heard his own name. It spread like a plague, his name quietly, circulating throughout the entire field. Even people who had now knew his name. Senior, wait a moment. Hearing the voice ahead, Chu Wanning paused and stopped walking. He raised his head and saw in front a pale and clean-cut boy. When the boy saw Chu Wanning, his face instantly turned bright red. Chu Wanning didn't respond, but he didn't leave immediately, waiting for the boy to explain why he had stopped. Senior, can I add your QQ? The clean-cut boy shyly and politely asked, speaking in what he thought was his most charming. Chu Wanning shook his head. I don't have that. The boy froze, and before he could recover, Chu Wanning had and continued on his way. The boy's face was filled with disbelief. Is he really that cold? How could he not have QQ? Who doesn't at this age? At the campus store, Chu Wanning softly asked inside, "Excuse me, how much is a bottle of mineral?" The shopkeeper, a young man, answered after hearing him, 1 yuan 50 per bottle. The little girl, Chu Wanning, clutched two, whispering doubts. I remember it was 1 yuan per. The owner cheerfully asked, "Is there a sports of?" It's a bit longer. Seeing Chu Wanning's conflicted, he said straightforwardly, "All right, 1 yuan per bottle." Only then did Chu Wanning hand him 2 coins. She took 2 bottles of mineral water. The young shop owner stared intently at the girls, thinking warmly, is this girl one of them? Why have I never seen her before? 2 bottles of mineral water, boss. Chen Fei shouted at the owner. He turned to glance at Chu Wanning's back. He was buying mineral for Zhang Yifeng to drink after running. Could it be that Chu Wanning was buying for? The shop owner glanced casually and 3 yuan for 1 bottle. 6 yuan for 2 bottles. Then he went back to lying down and watched. On the other side, on the red, I got into position in the middle of the track. It was a 3,000. The 400-meter track required 7.5. There were 11 participants, including Wang Mingju from my class. Wang Mingyu waved to the 28th class, raising his arm. He confidently declared, "Don't worry, everyone. I'll take first place in this. Go for it." The homeroom teacher and classmates cheered him on. However, they all seemed to overlook the fact that I was also in this. While warming up, Wang Mingju glanced at me. He scoffed disdainfully. "What's wrong with you? Not wearing shorts, but coming in long pants?" I sneered, patting one side of the patch Chu Wanning sewed. "What's it to you?" Wang Mingju couldn't care less about. He initially had no opinion about me, but seeing how Chu Wan suddenly got along so well with, unconsciously, he started to dislike. Why? Song Xinyao and Chu Wanning both got along. The girls in the class constantly admired him. This made Wang Mingyu very satisfied. He saw Song Xinyao holding 2 bottles of Jiao Jiao drink. Wang Mingju knew these were surely meant for him later. Damn Guxiaoze. At this moment, a sudden voice came from the side. I turned my head to look. It was a guy with a face as dark as Bao Qingtian's. Based on memory, I tentatively asked Tanlei. Tanlei smiled and patted me. Can't you recognize me? He was my classmate in grade. After the class reshuffle, we lost, but actually we were good friends. I was always ranked first in my, while he was consistently ranked. Tanlei suddenly lowered his and whispered sneakily to me. I saw your class in the 28th group line. Your class, that Chu Wanning. I had only heard of her, but never seen. She's actually so good looking, like a girl straight out of anime. I'm puzzled. How come I've never seen? While warming up, I replied, she's low-key and focused entirely on her. Tanlei shamelessly said, are you close? Give me her QQ, will you? I touched the patch on my pants and glanced around. Still, I couldn't spot Chu Wanning anywhere. We're not close. The teacher, holding the starting gun, shouted, take your position. With the sound of the gunshot, the 11 participants in this group, Wang Mingyu immediately Meanwhile, Tanlei and I were chatting in the. This guy seemed obsessed. She's truly the most beautiful. Brother, I've never asked you for anything in my life. Help me get her contact info, please. Look, there she is. Tanlei suddenly shouted loud. He saw Chu Wanning, holding 2 bottles of running lightly outside, looking like a fairy. This guy's eyes went completely round. Then in shock, he spun in place and rolled on the ground. I hurriedly stepped forward to help. At the same time, I glanced up at Chu Wanning. Chu Wanning smiled at me, shyly standing on the edge of the track, gently shaking the 2 bottles of mineral water, indicating that she had bought them. I smiled back silently. It felt like we shared an unspoken understanding without exchanging a word. Then we both averted our gazes. Honestly, apart from you, who else would cheer for me? Your timely appearance, Chu Wanning, and your timely smile made me feel an inexplicable sense of reassurance. You're holding me back. Look, everyone else has run ahead. I pulled Tanlei up. We immediately started chasing after the group. Wang Mingyu was still in the lead, running like a maniac, but his current performance delighted the girls. The girls from class 28, dressed in, were screaming madly, "Go Wang Mingyu. He's so handsome. If I could just say one word to him, my life would be complete." Tanlei, while running, expressed his feelings hysterically. I laughed. You're truly smitten. Is it that serious? He'll be in our exam room for the next month. He'll be last, then me, and then you, Tanlei. Isn't he the grade topper? I explained. Last time he performed far behind the others, the 2 of us soon caught a woman in her 30s adjusted her, yelling angrily at me. She yelled at me. Chatting, Gushaoze? If you don't finish first, just wait and see. Looking at my homeroom teacher glaring like a tiger, couldn't help but swallow nerve. I could only say to Tanla beside me, Brother, let's chat on the next lap. I better run this lap first. Tanla seemed like he didn't understand a word. I started to pick up my pace. This scene instantly attracted everyone's attention, including the PE teacher. The PE teacher was puzzled. What's this guy doing? Sprinting at this point? Is he out of his mind? The stamina, endurance, and strength, grant all these physical enhancements, might not have much use, but they were more than enough for the sports meet. I sprinted this lap at light. When I caught up to Wang Mingyu, his eyes widened in disbelief. No, Gushaoze, wait for me. Wang Mingyu, unwilling to admit defeat, but having used up so much to secure the lead earlier, he simply couldn't match my. Instead, he slowed down further, allowing the group behind him to gradually catch up. After successfully lapping him, I slowed down and jogged back. Seeing the alarm in his eyes, I explained I had no choice. My homeroom teacher is like a tigress. I'd better lap you first. For now, I'm in first place. Tanli was dumbfounded. Brother, you're making me look bad, I replied earnestly. Then let's speed up together. Tanli quickly quieted down because he realized we were approaching Chu, and the girl was watching him. Tanlei's dark face instantly, he scratched his head, wanting to say, but he didn't have the courage. He could only avoid Chu Wanning's gaze. Good luck, Chu Wanning said softly, a bit nervous. Tanlei didn't even dare to lift, quickly replied with a smile. Ah, sure! He thanked her as he passed by Chu Wanning's spot. He then turned his head to me. Your classmate Chu Wanning is quite I thought she had a cold personality. But after saying that, Tanlei noticed my strange gaze fixed on him. What? Do I really look handsome today? Come on, be honest, brother. It seemed Tanlei realized and quickly asked me excited. I scratched my head and gave an awkward smile. I didn't have the heart to dampen his spirits, especially since we were good friends. But just now, his confused look almost made me, because Chu Wanning was clearly cheering. When I reached the 5th lap, I noticed the small group behind. At that moment, he was still in the lead, but his first place position. The class teacher suddenly jumped out, shouting, Gu Xiaoze, what are you waiting for? They're catching up. The classmates in our clearly didn't expect to rely on me instead of their initial hope. Wang Mingyu had already fallen to the panting like an ox at that moment. I, on the other hand, seemed tireless and once again started striding forward. The PE teacher stared dumbfounded at the scene. This kid is still going strong? He's about to run 2 extra laps. As it was his own class, the PE couldn't help but shout but I seemed not to hear it. I just took bigger strides, doubling my speed. The small group behind me looked at the man sprinting ahead with a mix of, how the heck is he still running after a whole lap? Does he have an engine in his lungs or something? People had only heard that Gu Xiaoze was good at basket, but not that he was such a beast at long. As I sprinted the final lap and saw the finish line ahead, I deliberately slowed down because the second tier was a whole lap behind. With 20 meters to go, sweating profusely, he stretched out his arms and he mimicked the awkward gait of an ostrich. Step by step, he slowly advanced toward Class 28, erupted into loud, but my gaze was fixed only on Chu. Seeing Chu Wanning standing alone and I became even bold. Turning around, I continued mimicking the ostrich walk toward the finish line. Step by step, I backed across. The spectators from other classes were either laughing or frowning in disapproval. My antics this time seemed to have maximized the mockery. Even the usually serious class teacher rarely refrained from stopping my humorous because among the students in this was his rival teacher's student. He turned smugly to Cao Yan, who was standing nearby, and mockingly said, "Isn't he supposed to be great at running?" At that moment, Liu Wenqiang, who was looked at me in despair. As I crossed the finish, his spirit broke. Cao Yan snorted coldly. Haha, enjoy your group. I adjusted my posture and took a deep, spreading my arms wide toward Class 28, erupted into cheers and Not long after, Wang Mingyu and Tanlei also crossed the finish line. Exhausted, Wang Mingyu glanced at Song Xinyao. As he forced a smile, he noticed Song Xinyao wasn't looking. Instead, she was holding a drink and walking. Tanlei, leaning on his knees, was panting heavily when he froze in shock. He saw Chu Wanning jogging toward me with a bottle of water. She shyly extended the bottle of water to me. One side was an expensive drink, the other a cheap bottle of water. Song Xinyao looked dumbfounded at Chu Wanning. He couldn't believe that Chu Wanning would actually offer water. At the scene, students from all classes were astonished. Just as I became the center of attention, Chu Wanning's appearance made me the true focus of the crowd once. Gu Xiaoze, didn't you say you barely knew her? Tanlei stared at me in shock, slowly muttering sarcastic remarks about my not close, but she brings you water. You two aren't secretly dating, are you? And just pretending in front of me. Tanlei stood there, doubting his life, feeling betrayed and stabbed by a close friend. After all, when Chu Wanning cheered for him, he had already imagined himself and Chu exchanging wedding vows in a pure white chapel. Of course, Tanle wasn't the only one, feeling unsettled at this moment. Standing on the sidelines of the track, Chu Wanning was already in everyone. When they saw Chu holding 2 bottles of water, some had already sensed something unusual. Sure enough, the water was for some. But then again, who exactly was this playful? What was his relationship? Were they just friends? Or was it simply Chu Wanning supporting him for the class's honor? There was also an unspoken possibility lingering. If that possibility were true, then the thousands of innocent male students who had cheered for the swan-like goddess would be shrouded in the gloom of heartbreak. It seemed that almost everyone ignored the other person offering me a drink. I glanced at Xinyao and said flatly, "I don't drink that." Then I turned and smiled at Chu Wanning. Surprised, I asked Chu Wanning, "Both bottles are for me?" Chu Wanning nodded lightly, her slender white arms lifting the bottles. With the shyness of someone, she waited expectantly for me. I grabbed it without hesitation. Smiling, I glanced at Song Xinyao, who silently lowered her hand. Internally, she gritted her teeth and muttered, "I'll remember this." Then she turned to Wang Mingyu. Expressionless, she said, "Class." Wang Mingyu happily accepted the drink. "Thank you, Song." I smiled at Chu Wanning and said, Let's rest over there." After opening the water, I gulped down half the bottle. I wasn't sure if I was truly thirsty or if it was because Chu Wanning gave it, but the water tasted sweet. I chuckled at I realized that without noticing when, this girl had taken up a much larger space in my heart. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Noticing me staring at the bottle, Chu Wanning blinked slightly, then quickly stopped walking. Her face serious, she asked, "I can buy one for you. I have money." I quickly explained, No. I was just checking the brand. It's strange. It tastes pretty good." Chu Wanning tilted her head in confusion, but when she realized I wasn't complaining about her she smiled contentedly. Then she said, "Okay, I'll get you more water for your 800-meter run." I smiled and nodded. Chu Wanning smiled again. I was a little surprised. I noticed that, although she was smiling, could it be that she was enjoying this youthful experience today? I had to admit, I found myself staring at her, something that had never. After running 3,000 meters, I had no other events left for the morning. Becoming a free spirit. Walking together with Chu Wanning, I noticed the surroundings. Noticing the gazes gathering on the two of them were increasing. Not only girls were looking too. I couldn't help but think, if I were to hold Chu Wanning's hand right now, it would definitely cause a huge commotion across the entire. These high school boys and girls are just staring at others. Seeing classmates gathered around the 100-meter track, the two of us walked toward that direction. At this, Chu Wanning suddenly stuffed a tissue into my palm with lightning speed. I looked at her in surprise. Chu Wanning hesitated to speak, then quickly raised her pale finger and pointed to her fair cheek. "Oh, you want me to wipe your sweat, right?" Chu Wanning gently nodded. I laughed and said, "Why don't you just— my hand hurts. I can't." Chu Wanning instinctively reached, but seeing the crowd around us, she lowered her head, shyly quickened her pace and walked forward. Choosing to ignore my request, we arrived at the 100-meter. Zheng Feng was standing at the starting line, wearing a number tag on his chest, but looking half asleep. Chen Fei, holding a bottle, stood shyly among the crowd. Before the race even started, the class teacher yelled at Zheng Feng, "Open your eyes and look at the track." Zheng Feng obediently raised one hand to prop open his eyelid. As the starting gun, everyone around shot forward like bullets, but Zheng Feng jogged leisurely, like an old, casually following behind. The teacher's walking pace was almost parallel with his. A 30-something woman, flustered, followed her temple veins bulging with "Zheng Feng, are you Zheng Feng, are you listening to me?" Zheng Feng murmured in response, and finally lazily replied, "Teacher? Anyway, I can't outrun them. Might as well save my end." The 100-meter race, Zheng Feng's time was 1 minute, slower than walking. The class teacher even reached the finish line. His deskmate Chen Fei, smiling, he ran to the finish line, exhausted, a bottle of water to drink. The class teacher looked at Chen Fei in shock. "No wonder your desk— what a pair." I shifted my gaze from and turned to Chu Wanning. "Since you bought me water, I'll treat you to lunch." Chu Wanning took a deep breath and was about to refuse. I waved my hand. "It's just a meal." Chu Wanning, in the end, didn't insist and nodded slightly. "I'll go to the restaurant, then come find you." I waved my hand. "Hurry up. I'll wait. After Chu Wanning, I continued standing by the 100, watching the subsequent. After watching several rounds of most of the classmates had gone to the cafeteria, but I still didn't see Chu Wanning return. Did she go for a long one? I checked my watch, feeling puzzled. Waited another 15 minutes. Still no sign of her. Without hesitation, I immediately ran toward the direction. Something must have. If someone wants to use the restroom, the fastest option is to go to the first floor of. I wasn't sure which teaching building went to on the first floor, so I chose the one closest to me, the sophomore teaching, and arrived at the restroom. In front of the girls' restroom, I saw a cleaning in progress sign on. To be cautious, I called out toward the direction of the girls' restroom. Chu Wanning. I heard a faint, tearful response. The sound came from inside. I frowned and kicked aside the cleaning in progress sign. In that instant, the sign had been deliberately placed there. Its purpose was clear: to stop anyone from entering this girl's restroom and discovering Chu. I rushed into the rest. What I saw were tightly closed stalls. The sound was coming from the last stall in the corner. This stall was a bit unusual. Its latch was on the outside. If the latch was closed from the person inside couldn't get out. I recognized it as a storage. Even the boys' restroom. I immediately unlocked the latch. It was then that I saw Chu Wanning curled up in the corner of the crying sorrowfully. Her eyes were red and her hair looked disheveled as I had never seen her this heart. I quickly scanned Chu Wanning from head to toe. Seeing no visible injury, I let out a brief sigh of relief, then gently asked her, "What happened? Are you hurt?" Chu Wanning shook her head. No, but she kept crying so hard that I couldn't help but think of her birthday last time. But the two situations were complete. This time, on Chu Wanning's face, I saw only sadness and despair. Just as I was about to, her voice abruptly stopped. I saw Chu Wanning trembling as she extended. In her pale palm lay several severely twisted and broken pink hair pieces that seemed to have been deliberately stomped. Chu Wanning bit her lip, tears streaming as she said, "They broke it. The hair clip you gave me is. I just tried to fix it, but I couldn't. I've been trying for so long." Guxiao's. I couldn't fix it. She kept choking on her word, repeating, "I couldn't fix," as she carefully touched the pink frag in her palm with her fingertips. It was as if she had lost something and deeply mean, a possession that, once broken, could never be. This caused her normally strong to crumble under the weight of despair. But I didn't quite understand. It was just a hair clip. Was it really worth carrying? Even so, I frowned and quickly grabbed her arm. This isn't the place to we can talk outside." But just as I finished, voices of several girls came from they were chatting. I reacted quickly and hurried back into the stall, quietly closing the door. Then I turned to Chu Wanning and today, Chu Wanning was very notable. Everyone could recognize. If the girls discovered she was in the restroom with a boy, who knows what kind of rumor. Rumors are terrifying things. Instead of explaining the situation, I chose to avoid the risk altogether. We would wait until they finished and left, and I knew, even if I explained that Chu Wanning was being bullied, the truth would never reach others. In its original form, "Did you see Wanning today? She looked stunning." "Yeah, I saw her. I'm curious though, why hadn't we heard any stories about her before the midterm exam? Maybe she kept a low profile." I frowned. These girls were chatting casually, and not even about going to the restroom. They could talk anywhere. But why here for so long? Just then, the cleaning lady's voice interrupted, asking. A few girls went back. "I don't know. I really don't. It was there when we arrived." I heard it. The cleaning lady was walking toward the broom closet. This made me pause. Shadows appeared under the door gap. Just as I thought, the cleaning lady opened the broom closet door. The lock outside only made a faint click sound. I remembered I had locked. The cleaning lady muttered and left. Then she yelled at a few girls, "Are you using the toilet? Don't do anything bad here." "We didn't do anything." "Yeah, we didn't do anything." The girls mumbled as they left the restroom. The cleaning lady's voice gradually faded. Inside the stall, I stood frozen, staring dumbfounded at the stall door. I raised my hand and gently, it didn't budge. I pushed harder. Still, the cleaning lady had locked it from the outside. I pushed harder a couple of times, but it still. In the end, I turned around, feeling a bit helpless, and said to who was standing in the corner, "Chu Wanming." The girl didn't seem to care at all whether the door was locked. She just lowered her head, completely focused on piecing together some fragments in her palm. It seemed like she thought that if she could piece them, maybe she could use 502 glue. Even if it couldn't be used normal, at least the fragments would, as long as they were there and intact. I stared at her for a while and said, "It seems like a piece is." Chu Wanming looked up with an incredibly, I remember collecting all of it. Tears fell like broken pearls, splashing onto the broom closet floor. "Why is one piece missing?" I clearly saw where each piece fell. She choked as she spoke, her lips trembling with her arms and shoulders shaking. I had never seen her this clearly. Sadness and despair were written all over. For the first time, I couldn't hold back. I stepped forward and gently closed Chu Wanning. I softly embraced her frail body. It's okay, it's okay. If it's broken, I'll get you. If one's not enough, if two's not enough, if three's not enough, 10. I spoke as if comforting. Chu Wanning let out a muffled sob, pouring out all her grievances. She immediately held on to me tightly, burying her face in my chest. A warm, damp feeling spread through. It felt as though her sorrow burned a hole. I gently stroked while softly speaking. Trust me. This time, Chu Wanning, you have me. With me here, everything will be different from before. Do you believe that? The girl, lost in sadness, did not respond to my words. Her sobbing was muffled. I didn't know how many times Chu Wanning had cried like this, suppressing. I only knew that the fragile, soft body in my arm seemed ready, so I didn't dare use any strength in my embrace. But Chu Wanming's thin body held onto me tightly, very tight. I could probably guess that this was perhaps the first time in Chu Wanming's life that in her sadness and despair, she had someone to freely and unrestrainedly seek. As for the words I had just spoken to her, maybe Chu Wanning didn't hear them, or maybe she didn't understand their deeper meaning. She might have just taken them as simple. I didn't need her to understand. All I wanted to convey was one thing. In this lifetime with me here, Chu Wanning will never be bullied again. No matter if the opponent is a person, I silently told myself in my heart, the existence of this girl, perhaps this is the meaning of. Gently patting Chu Wanming's shoulder, I began to look around the environment. The broom closet hadn't changed. The floor was flat, white tiles. The space was less than 2 square. Only a few mops were leaning in. Like other stalls, the upper space was open. If the door wouldn't open, the top might be the only exit. But there was no support, and the partition was tall and thin, making it difficult to climb over. If there was a toilet inside, it could serve it. But unfortunately, while I was thinking of a solution, a soft, furry sensation touched my. It turned out Chu Wanming had lifted her head. Her sobbing had quieted down. Her nose was red as she loosened her arm, sniffling as she retreated. She lowered her head, sneaking a glance at the hairpin fragments. Then, carefully and earnestly, holding them close to her chest, her slightly hair partially covered her fair face. It seemed that Chu Wanming had, but her first reaction after calming down was to shrink into the corner like a small, injured animal, instinctively seeking a hiding place. I'm sorry, she said softly from the corner. I looked at her surprised. What are you apologizing for? For hugging me tightly just now? I realized and couldn't help but laugh. There's nothing. When I'm sad, I also hug the people around me. Besides, I was the one who hugged you first. Chu Wanming didn't respond. I looked at her and asked, are you hungry? As soon as I said it, I wanted to slap myself. Asking such a question in a bathroom was ridiculous. Chu Wanming gently shook her head. Then she lifted her face, her red eyes looking toward the door. Can't we get out? I shrugged helplessly. It's locked from the. But don't worry, we won't need to call for help. We can get out on our own, and asking for probably wouldn't work either. There's likely no one outside. It's lunchtime right now. There are probably only a few people left on. Who would come to the first floor restroom in the. Plus, we can't call for. The fact that are locked in the women's restroom can't be known. I don't mind really, but what I care about is Chu Wanming's Chu Wanming suddenly pouted and started sobbing. I need to use the bathroom. I can't. I slowly raised an eyebrow. The bathroom? Do you mean you haven't gone since we got here? Chu Wanming immediately, tears flinging away in frustration. She had been blocked by a group of girls. Then she was locked in this broom closet without. I looked at the girl, standing helplessly in front of me. She seemed like she really couldn't hold. Her long legs, wrapped in black stockings, were and her snow-white thighs were pressed. I proposed an idea. How about you just take care of it here? After all, it's a restroom. It doesn't have to be in the toilet. As soon as I finished, I noticed Chu Wanming. Her beautiful, tearful eyes looked at me with hesitation and At that moment, I suddenly realized the lack of a toilet wasn't the biggest. The biggest issue was that I quickly turned around. Chu Wanming said, but without a toilet, it'll get on my shoes. I hurriedly responded, shoes are just. It doesn't matter if. After I said it, I froze. Chu Wanming cared so much about. How could she not care about her own shoes? At this point, I turned and looked at her seriously. I have that can get your feet off the ground. Just need to sacrifice my shoes. Do you know how parents help their children use the toilet? Chu Wanning stiffened. I quickly put away my joke and corrected myself. I have another idea. I placed 2 mops on either side, letting Chu Wanning step on the mop. This created a natural groove in the middle. Afterward, I turned around. Chu Wanning couldn't care about and hurriedly squatting down to. With a strange look, I faced and awkwardly rubbed my eyes with my. These brief 20 seconds felt like a peculiar torment for both me and Chu Wanning. Are you done or not? A faint, soft sound came from behind, the sound of quick mopping. Once the noise stopped, I turned around, but there was a hint of a suppressed smile on. Given the current situation, I had to force myself to ignore it and observe this. There are three solutions. One, I climb up, but without something to step on, it might be a bit challenging. The partition might just collapse entirely, but I'm strong. Don't worry about me getting hurt. Second, you step on me to climb. The same procedure as above. Third, I break the door by. Chu Wanning immediately said, I'll step. I quickly pulled her back. What are you thinking? You're wearing a dress? Although I really wanted Chu Wanning to step, even if it would be a failed attempt, given the situation, it's better not to waste time. Chu Wanning is a girl without much core strength. Climbing would be. After saying that, I used the wall as leverage. With a spin midair, I grabbed the top of the partition. The movements were smooth. The partition was somewhat so I carefully adjusted my position. Using the partition nearby, I managed to lay my whole body across. Chuan, you stood below, raising your small hands with words, looking anxious, as if afraid I might fall, but I crossed over smoothly, landing with a thud on the other side, followed by the sound of Suo Chao. The door creaked open. Chu Wanning stood opposite me. I spread my hands, smiling proudly. Am I amazing or what? Chu Wanning nodded with a smile. Amazing. I reached out to him. Come with me. Chu Wanning, without hesitation, placed his hand in. I quickly held the girl's hand and escaped, not letting go until we finally released each other's hand, walking forward slowly with a person's width between us. Chu Wanning glanced in his hand and carefully put it in his pocket. I didn't ask what those girls were called or which, because I knew Chu Wanning would never trouble others, especially those who were. She's very stubborn. Very, very stubborn. She'd rather bear it all herself than bother anyone else. That's just her personality. I really couldn't do anything about it. But not asking didn't mean the matter was over. I was never one to swallow my anger. I turned to look at Chu Wanning and cheerfully said, which floor for lunch? What do you want to eat? But looking at Chu Wanning's red nose and eyes, I felt heartbroken. I couldn't smile. I raised my hand to smooth her long hair. At that moment, a student passed by. Chu Wanning quickly avoided my hand, then turned sideways and used her small hands to tidy up that. Anything is fine. Taking a deep breath and gazing ahead at the road. This time I must intervene. At noon, after we ate, Chu Wanning packed up the leftovers and went home. I didn't ask much. It was probably for her father, because I had an 800-meter event. Chu Wanning thought to bring me 2 bottles. While passing by the campus, she glanced at the young store owner who kept smiling foolishly at her. Hey, little girl, what are you buying today? Mineral water? We've got it. Chu Wanning glanced at the mineral water in the fridge, but didn't speak immediately. Her gaze shifted to the screams. She was about to say something, when suddenly a figure appeared. Chu Wanning turned to see it was her classmate, Chen Fei stood with her arms crossed near, glaring at the store owner and sternly said to Chu Wanning, don't mind, you buy first. The young store owner gave an indifferent glance, then continued grinning at Chu Wanning. So, made up your mind, little, what are you buying? Chu Wanning wanted to buy, even though I said mineral water was fine. She knew. That soda must taste better than water. How much is this? Chu Wanning carefully pointed to the screen and asked hesitantly. After she took out a 5 yuan note from her pocket and quietly glanced at the note in her hand. The owner laughed. 3 yuan a bottle. Chen Fei immediately widened her eyes in surprise. Scream is 3 yuan a bottle. So cheap? Even during the sports, it's the same price as mineral water. After Chu Wanning pursed her lips and awkwardly glanced aside out of the. Chen Fei cautiously spoke up. Can I buy 2 bottles for 5 yuan? Chen Fei turned to stare at Chu Wanning. You're so shameless. Chu Wanning noticed Chen Fei's gaze, her earlobes, and she looked up to observe the young owner froze for a moment. He quickly nodded. Sure, absolutely no problem. He then swiftly opened the fridge and placed 2 bottles of Scream soda. Chu Wanning happily put the 5 yuan note on picked up the 2 bottles of soda. She walked away without as if afraid he might. The young owner shouted after her. Chu Wanning turned slightly and nodded shyly. After Chu Wanning left, Chen Fei quickly turned. Give me 2 bottles of Scream. The young owner placed 2 without any expression. 12 yuan. Chen Fei paused. His face stiffened. What did you say? Holding the 2 bottles of Scream soda, Chu Wanning walked to. She saw me sitting in the class. There were quite a few people there, so she didn't go over. Chu Wanning was in a good mood. She smiled while looking down, suddenly curious about how they might taste. But then, she decided to wait for another opportunity. These 2 bottles were for Gu Shao. At Class 28's rest area, I sat on a chair and turned looking seriously at a bald guy. The homeroom teacher was also staring in the same direction. The guy was obviously an athlete, and at the moment, he was stretching with a pair of lifeless eyes on his. The homeroom teacher this guy was clearly an athlete, At the moment, he was in front of his class's rest, casually doing stretching with a pair of lifeless fish eyes on. Just his expression alone made him seem funny. But I couldn't help but laugh when I saw the homeroom teacher mutter, "He seems to be the 800-meter champion from the... He's really good at middle distance." Before I could respond, the bald guy turned to me seriously. He knew I was strong. I looked away. His serious face. If we made eye contact during the race, I really couldn't hold. If we looked at each other while running, it would be a catastrophe. The race was about to start. On this, Chu Wanning walked over with 2 bottles. The 800-meter race was a popular. There were many spectators. Chu Wanning didn't try to squeeze in. She stood far away by herself, waiting for the crowd to disperse. At the starting line near the track, I kept thinking to myself, "Don't look at me." But the bald guy still turned to look at me. We ended up running next to each. He said something serious with a serious expression. "Gu Xiaoze, I heard you're strong. Why don't you dare look me in the eye?" In my mind, thousands of mythical... The whistle blew. A group of runners shot forward like cannonballs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chu Wanning. She widened her and quickly raised her arm, clenching her small pale fist to silently... At that moment, my legs felt filled with strength. I quickly sprinted forward, running side by side. This guy had explosive power, but weak endurance. He'd win the first, but I'd catch up in the second. Soon the second lap began. I gritted my teeth and gently accelerated into a 400. A low growl like an engine came from the bald guy turned to look serious, watching me slowly overtake him with a... He stared seriously at my back with an extremely serious face as I left him behind. "No, this is impossible." Absolutely, he thought seriously in his heart. Before the race, he clearly didn't even dare to look at himself. Could it be that he's pretending to be weak? Damn it, you don't play fair. The bald man silently cursed in his heart. The second lap, without suspense, I reached the finish as the first one to finish. As a popular competition event, the 800-meter race was absolutely eye-catching. Many girls' gazes turned toward me. Their expressions became subtle. This was a perfect moment for a hormonal... "Gu Xiaoze, you're amazing. I'm in love with you." "Brat!" shouted the homeroom teacher, jumping up in excitement. Like a child, I raised an eyebrow smugly at him. The entire class 28 cheered for me. Happily, I looked at Chu Wanning at the back of the first thing I thought of after winning was seeing my gaze. Chu immediately raised 2 bottles in her hand, shaking them lightly, gesturing shyly toward me. Seeing this, I quickly ran over. At the finish line, the class 29 looked at me with a puzzled expression. He was confused. In his memory, this student of his was never active in anything. He would never participate in sports comp. Why was his attendance so high this semester? It didn't matter. Even if the grades were still at the class 29 losing to class 20 would be compensated for in the class average score in the Qingda. Thinking of this, Cao Yan looked at the homeroom with a bit more confidence in his eyes. Did the homeroom teacher think as long as your class has Gu Xiaoze, it's impossible to improve your average? With the top student and the weak, I don't know whether to congratulate you or... On the other side, I looked at the bottle of Scream in Chu Wanning's hand. "You bought me a drink?" Chu Wanning nodded slightly. He quickly handed over both bottles for me to drink. I only took one. Looking at him, I said, "2 bottles, one for each of us." Chu Wanning shook his head. "I'm not. They're both for you." I responded seriously. "You're one for each of us. Got it? I'm not asking." "I understand." Chu Wanning probably hadn't had drinks like that. Hearing my command, Chu Wanning instinctively didn't. He nodded, "All right." Then he took the Scream bottle in his... He raised it to but he discovered there was another layer of plastic. He wasn't sure how to drink it. "Isn't it just supposed to open and drink directly?" He looked up at me. I slowly opened the cap and peeled off the thin plastic film. Chu Wanning quickly mimicked my action. After removing the plastic, he brought the bottle to his mouth. Seeing this, I quickly, smiling, I said, wait, that's not how you..." Hearing this, Chu Wanning handed the drink with both hands, smiling awkwardly. "I haven't drunk I laughed. "It's okay. I'll show you how." Suddenly, my nose tingled. He spent a few days' work to buy 2 bottles for me. Drinks he'd never had before and were... What did I do to be treated so kindly by Chu Wanning? I reclosed the bottle cap, squeezing the bottle and aiming Chu Wanning's eyes as he looked curiously at the He looked down in surprise, noticing the nozzle. "So there's a hole here." I nodded. "That's right. Your turn." Chu Wanning hesitated, feeling shy about doing... He held the bottle with both hands. I lifted his arm slightly, encouraging him to follow my... Chu Wanning raised his hand and opened his... He made a sucking sound. After a while, no drink came out. Then he realized he hadn't squeezed the bottle, so he applied a bit more... The drink shot out from the bottle. It entered his mouth, savoring the sweetness of the drink. Chu Wanning's eyes sparkled with delight. He turned to me in surprise for a moment, then stopped squeezing He lowered his head to inspect the bottle, curious. Who would have thought that this ordinary bottle, worth just a few, would have such a sophisticated design? It should be reusable. Yet so many people simply throw it. What a waste, he murmured, cradling He took a couple more sips, a satisfied smile spreading. Then he screwed the cap back on and quietly stood to the side, watching. As I drank, he looked on with contentment because it was something he bought for me. Seeing, I turned to him and asked, "Why aren't you drinking?" Chu Wanning opened his mouth slightly as if to speak. He glanced at me cautiously but said nothing. I continued, "Do you want to save it for your dad?" He opened his mouth, then shyly scratched his head with his hand, silently confirmed. I took a deep breath and said, "This bottle is for you. I'll buy one for your dad. You've treated me so many times. Why can't I treat your dad once?" Chu Wanning quickly looked up and said, No, I just wanted to try the taste." I shook my head. I felt a pang of heartache a deep ache. This girl never thought of herself. "Come on, let's go to the school shop and buy your dad a drink. I'll get some snacks too." I walked cheerfully, holding Chu Wanning's warm little hand. We headed to the campus shop. Luckily, the next 800-meter race had started. No one noticed the two of us, walking hand in hand. For a moment, Chu Wanning forgot to let go of my. He marveled at the changes happening to him, but he was happy about those changes. Walking side by side with Gu Xiaoze in public, something so simple, was something he had wished for 3 or 4 years.